She snatched the toy fighter jet right out of a 7-year-old boy's hands and threw it onto the floor of a packed commercial aircraft. The cabin went dead silent. Not one person said a word. But the man sitting next to that little boy. He didn't yell, didn't stand up, didn't even raise his voice. He simply reached down, picked up the toy, and placed it back into his son's hands with the steadiness of someone who had faced things far more terrifying than a woman in a cream blazer. What no one on that plane knew, what no one could have possibly guessed, would bring an entire military base to a standstill. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. And if something here moves you, subscribe, because this one is just getting started. The morning that changed everything began the way most mornings did for Raymond Cole, quietly, without ceremony, and with the particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from a bad night's sleep, but from years of carrying more than one man was built to carry alone. He was up before the sun, not by alarm. He hadn't needed an alarm in 4 years. His body simply refused to let him sleep past 5:15 anymore, as if some internal mechanism had been rewired by grief and responsibility into something that no longer recognized rest as a right. He lay still for a moment in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the small bedroom in the house on Caldwell Street in Memphis, Tennessee. A house he owned outright because he'd paid it off with military back pay and 2 years of double shifts at Brennan's Aviation Repair. And because owning something outright was the only kind of security a man in his position had ever learned to trust. He could hear Jalen down the hall. His son was 7 years old, and even at 7, the boy had already learned to be quiet in the mornings. That knowledge broke Raymond every single time he thought about it. A 7-year-old shouldn't know how to be quiet. A 7-year-old should make noise, should tear through a house like a storm, should demand breakfast and cartoons and attention with the full authority of someone who has never once had to consider whether his need for something was inconvenient to someone else. But Jalen had learned in the years since his mother passed that mornings were fragile, that his father moved through them like a man navigating a minefield, functional, careful, and very, very focused on not stepping wrong. So the boy was quiet. And Raymond hated himself a little every morning for having taught him that. He got up, pulled on his work jeans. Not the ones he'd packed for the trip, but his regular ones out of habit, the ones with the grease stain on the left knee that never fully washed out, no matter what he tried, and padded to the kitchen in his socks to start coffee. He stood at the counter while the machine ran and looked at the small framed photograph on the windowsill. Dara, smiling. Her hair pulled back the way she wore it when she was relaxed, when she wasn't thinking about how she looked, when she was just herself in the kitchen on a Sunday with nowhere to be. She'd been gone 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. He didn't count on purpose. He'd simply never forgotten the number, and it had never stopped updating. Daddy, he turned. Jalen was standing in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas, the blue ones with the small airplanes printed all over them. He was holding his toy F-22 Raptor in one hand, the one Raymond had given him on his 5th birthday, the one with the small crack along the left wing from when it had fallen off the coffee table that time. Jalen never let Raymond fix the crack. He said it made the plane look like it had been through something. Even at 7, the kid had a philosophy. "Morning, Jay. Are we still going today?" "Yeah." Raymond poured his coffee. "We're still going." Jalen's face did something complicated, something that tried to be excitement, but was also underneath a layer of anxiety that Raymond recognized because it was the same expression he saw in his own mirror. The boy had never been on a plane before. He had a father who had once flown things that broke the sound barrier, and he had never once been on a commercial aircraft because the timing had never been right, because there had always been something else. Because after Dara died, there was a long stretch of time when Raymond Cole wasn't capable of planning anything further than 3 days out. But this trip was for Raymond's mother, Grandma Cecile, 72 years old and recovering from hip surgery in Atlanta, Georgia, who had specifically requested that she see her grandson before the summer ended. Because, as she had told Raymond on the phone, "I'm not getting any younger, Raymond, and neither is that boy, and I am not spending whatever time I have left looking at photographs on a phone screen." So they were going. Raymond had saved for 2 months to book business class. He'd thought about it, gone back and forth, almost talked himself out of it. But Jalen had never been on a plane, and Raymond wanted the first time to be good. Wanted the seats to be wide enough that his son could fall asleep against his shoulder. Wanted the kid to have the window. Wanted something, just one thing, to feel easy and generous and uncomplicated. He'd checked the account 3 times after booking it. The money was gone, but the tickets were real. It was going to be a good trip. 10. Memphis International Airport was the particular variety of controlled chaos that airports always are at 7 in the morning, rolling luggage and paper coffee cups and families moving in opposite directions, with the concentrated urgency of people who are acutely aware that the world will not wait for them. Raymond moved through it with Jalen's hand in his, and their one rolling suitcase behind him. He wore clean dark jeans, a plain gray Henley, and the pair of work boots he'd resoled twice because they were the most comfortable thing he owned. His hands showed what they always showed, the permanent lines of engine grease that no amount of scrubbing fully removed the calluses across the palm from years of tools, and before that, from years of a different kind of work entirely. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with the quiet bearing of a man who had spent years in environments where stillness was not a passive quality, but an active discipline. People glanced at him the way they always did. He was used to it. He'd been used to it his entire life. Jalen beside him was vibrating with barely contained energy, the toy F-22 clutched against his chest, his head turning in every direction at once as he tried to take in the entire airport simultaneously. He asked questions in a steady stream. Why do the planes have numbers on them? Daddy, how long does it take to go up? What if we hit a bird? I heard birds are bad for planes. Is that true? And Raymond answered every single one quietly and correctly, and with the patient attention of a man who considered no question from his son to be unworthy of a real answer. They got through security. They found the gate. They boarded early because Raymond had paid for priority boarding, another small luxury he'd allowed himself, because he didn't want to be the man standing in a long line with a kid who was anxious. And that was when she appeared. She was already in her seat when they came down the aisle, 2A window business class. Raymond and Jalen were 2C and 2D the aisle and middle on the other side. She was at first simply a woman in a business class seat, somewhere in her early 50s, expensively dressed, the kind of cream blazer that communicated not just money, but the particular confidence of someone who had never in their adult life had to check a price tag before deciding whether they could afford something. She was on her phone when they passed. She glanced up. The glance took approximately 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, her eyes moved from Raymond's boots to his hands to his face and back to his clothes. And something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not with any single obvious gesture, but in the way that a thermostat shifts the almost imperceptible drop in temperature that happens before a room becomes cold. Raymond noticed. He always noticed. He had been noticed that way his entire life. He said nothing. He guided Jalen into 2D. The middle seat settled the rolling suitcase in the overhead and sat down in 2C. He helped his son with the seatbelt. He answered 2 more questions about turbulence. He settled in. The woman across the aisle put her phone down. "Excuse me." Her voice was precise, not loud, but calibrated the voice of someone accustomed to being heard. "Is there a mistake with your boarding passes?" Raymond looked at her. "No, ma'am. These are business class seats." "Yes, ma'am, I know." A pause. She looked at him again, the full assessment, this time more deliberate, more open about it. Her gaze dropped to his hands on the armrest, to the worn knee of his jeans. "Are you certain?" she said. "Because I've found that sometimes there are mix-ups at the gate. They put people in the wrong. There's no mix-up." Raymond's voice was level, quiet, entirely without aggression. "These are our seats." Another pause, longer this time. "All right," she said. The 2 words carried everything she hadn't said out loud. Jalen, between Raymond and the window he was now pressing his face against, hadn't heard the exchange. He was too busy watching the ground crew. Raymond looked forward and said nothing. The flight was scheduled for 1 hour and 40 minutes. Memphis to Atlanta, a short hop by any measure. something most business travelers slept through or used to answer emails. It became something else entirely. It started approximately 20 minutes after takeoff, when the drink service came through, and Jalen, delighted by the whole production of it, knocked his cup of apple juice, a small cup, mostly finished, against the tray table, and it tipped, and a thin splash of juice landed on the empty seat between his row and the woman's. It didn't touch her. It didn't come close to touching her. Jalen immediately said, "Sorry, sorry, sorry," in the rapid, apologetic way of a child who has been taught to be responsible for his mistakes, and Raymond was already reaching for napkins before the word finished. The woman looked at the splash, a small, faint stain on an empty seat, as if something had been done to her directly. "That," she said, "is exactly what I mean." Raymond looked up. "People who aren't accustomed to flying in spaces like this," she continued, her voice pitched to carry, "don't understand how to behave in them." She said it to no one specific. She said it to the cabin. 40 passengers in earshot. The flight attendant, a young woman named according to her badge. Teresa looked between the woman and Raymond with the particular expression of someone who is very aware of where they are and what their job requires of them, and who is very desperately hoping the situation resolves without requiring her to do something difficult. Nobody said anything. Raymond finished cleaning the tray. He folded the napkins. He placed them in the small trash bag the flight attendant was holding. He said thank you to Teresa. He looked at his son. "You all right, Jay?" Jalen nodded, though his jaw was tight in the way Raymond recognized the way the kid's jaw got when he was working hard at not showing something. "Just sit back," Raymond said quietly. "Look out the window." But the woman wasn't finished. This was the part of it that Raymond would carry with him later. Not the first comment, not even the second, but the fact that she wasn't finished. That she looked at a 7-year-old child and a man who had not raised his voice or made a single aggressive gesture, and she decided she had more to say. "I fly this route twice a month," she announced to the general cabin. She was looking at Raymond now, directly. "And I have never seen a boarding like this morning's. The gate agents, they let anyone through now, apparently." She gave a small, precise laugh, the kind that's designed to invite agreement. "It used to mean something. Business class. It used to mean something. Ma'am." This was from a man 3 rows back, middle-aged, in a suit. He said the word and then said nothing else. The woman looked at him. "I'm simply making an observation." "You're making a scene," the man said, quietly. But he said it, and then he looked back at his laptop and said nothing more. The woman's expression tightened. She looked back at Raymond. "Your boots," she said, and the way she said it was the most deliberate thing she'd done, a considered choice. "You tracked something in when you walked by." She looked down at the aisle. "I could smell it from here." Raymond's hands resting on the armrests were perfectly still. Jalen had turned from the window. The boy was looking at his father. His eyes were large, and the jaw was not just tight now, it was trembling the way a jaw trembles when the emotion behind it is becoming too large to contain. He was 7 years old, and he was watching a woman in a cream blazer tell his father in a cabin full of silent adults that he smelled bad, that he didn't belong, that his presence in this space was a contamination, and his father had not moved, had not raised his voice, had not done a single thing. Jalen looked at the woman with the particular fury of a child who does not yet know how to keep that fury small, and he said, "My daddy worked really hard to buy these seats." The woman blinked. "Jay." Raymond's voice, soft. "He did," Jalen said. His voice was shaking. "He saved up. He told me. He wanted it to be nice for me." "And you're being mean to him and he didn't do anything." The woman stared at the child. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, not yet, but something adjacent to surprise, as if she hadn't expected the child to have a voice. "Sweetheart," she started, in a tone that shifted toward condescension. "I'm sure your father is very—" "He's a great dad," Jalen said. "He's the best dad." The boy's chin was up. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't letting anything fall. "And you should stop." A beat of silence. Raymond put his hand on his son's arm. "That's enough, Jay." "Dad." "I heard you." Raymond looked at his son. His voice was quiet and entirely certain. "I heard every word. Thank you." He held the boy's eyes for a moment, a full, complete look that said, "I see you, and I am not hurt, and I am not broken, and we are okay." And then he looked back at the forward cabin wall and said nothing more. Jalen sat back slowly. His jaw was still tight, but he sat back. Muttered. It was then, in that particular silence that had fallen over business class like a held breath, that it happened. The woman reached across the narrow aisle. She reached across, and she picked up the toy F-22 Raptor from where it rested on Jalen's tray table. She picked it up and looked at it with an expression of theatrical distaste, and she said, "This is a business class cabin, not a playroom." And she dropped it. She didn't throw it. She simply opened her fingers and let it fall. It clattered off the edge of Jalen's tray, bounced off the seat, and hit the floor of the aisle with a hard plastic crack that was in the silence of that cabin enormously loud. Jalen made a sound. Small. Involuntary. The sound of a 7-year-old who has just watched something precious treated like garbage. Raymond was out of his seat before anyone else moved. Not in anger. There was no lunge, no raised voice, no aggressive motion. He simply stood, reached down to the floor of the aisle, picked up the toy F-22, and checked it. Turned it over in his large, calloused hands, examined the wing with the existing crack, checked for new damage, ran his thumb along the fuselage, the way a man checks something he understands intimately, the way someone inspects a thing they know from the inside out. He found no new damage. He turned and placed the plane back into his son's hands with deliberate gentleness, wrapping Jalen's small fingers around it, meeting the boy's eyes for just a moment. Then he sat back down. The woman was watching him. The cabin was watching him. And Raymond Cole. 43-year-old mechanic, single father, resident of Caldwell Street, Memphis, Tennessee. A man whose hands were permanently marked by years of work, who had worn the same boots for 4 years, who had saved 2 months for the seats he was sitting in. Raymond Cole looked straight ahead and said absolutely nothing, because he had been here before. Not here on this plane with this woman in this specific moment, but here in this particular position, at this precise intersection of race and class, and the judgment of strangers. He had been here so many times and in so many forms, that he knew with the certainty of long experience that there was no version of reacting that ended well for him. There was no sentence he could say that wouldn't be used against him. There was no tone of voice that wouldn't be characterized as threatening. There was no way to defend himself in that cabin, in front of 40 silent witnesses, that wouldn't transform him from a wronged man into a dangerous one in the retelling. He knew this the way he knew how to breathe. So he breathed, and he sat, and he was still. No. Teresa, the flight attendant, appeared beside the woman's seat. "Ma'am," she said with the particular careful professionalism of someone who has decided to act and has chosen her words accordingly. "I need to ask you not to touch other passengers' belongings." The woman looked at her. "I was simply—" "That is a child's property," Teresa said. "And I need to ask you not to handle it again." A beat. "Are you serious?" the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Teresa's face was entirely neutral. "I am completely serious." Another passenger, a woman in her 60s, 3 rows back, who had been silent throughout, began to applaud. Just twice. 2 deliberate, unhurried claps. Then she stopped, and the silence came back. The woman in the cream blazer turned forward and said nothing. Jalen pressed himself into his father's side. Raymond put his arm around his son, and the plane flew on. He thought about Dara. He always thought about Dara in the hard moments. Not out of sentimentality. He was not by nature a sentimental man, but because Dara had understood something about him that almost no one else ever had. She had understood that his calm was not passivity, that his quiet was not surrender. That when Raymond Cole became very still, it was not because he had nothing inside him, it was because he had learned at great cost that what was inside him required careful management. She had called it the discipline. She'd said it the way someone says something they deeply respect, with a kind of reverence. "I know what it costs you," she'd told him once, after a particularly ugly incident at a garage where he'd been working, where a customer had spoken to him in a way that had required the full deployment of the discipline. "I know what you hold back, and I need you to know I see it. Even when no one else does, I see it." He had married her partly for that sentence. He had loved her completely for the 100,000 things that came before and after it. And now she was gone, and he was on a plane, and their son was pressed against his side with his jaw tight, and his toy plane clutched in both hands, and the discipline was all Raymond had. He used it. Jalen fell asleep somewhere over central Tennessee. The tension of the morning, the early wake-up, the overwhelming input of the airport and the plane and the confrontation that no 7-year-old should have had to witness it all collected into exhaustion, and the boy's head dropped against his father's arm and his breathing slowed and deepened. Raymond didn't move. He sat with his son sleeping against him and the toy F-22 still in Jalen's loosening grip, and he looked out the window past his son's head at the flat gray expanse of cloud beneath them, and he thought, as he sometimes did in the particular private hours that belonged only to him, about what it had felt like. The Raptor. The F-22 was not a plane you flew. That was the thing civilians never understood when he tried to explain it, in the rare instances he tried to explain it. You didn't fly an F-22. You became part of it. It was responsive in a way that felt telepathic, that reacted to inputs before they were fully formed, that seemed to anticipate the body's intention and act on it with a precision that sometimes in the high, thin air, at 40,000 feet, with the afterburners lighting up and the world below becoming irrelevant, sometimes felt less like piloting and more like becoming. He had been one of his best. He said that without vanity, the way you state a documented fact. Test scores, simulations, live sorties, combat assessments. The numbers said it. The evaluations said it. His commanders said it. Shadowhawk. They'd given him the call sign early the second year because of what his flight instructor had written in a report. Flies like a shadow. You don't hear him coming, and by the time you see him, it's already over. He had flown for 9 years. He had left on his own terms, which meant he had left when Dara got sick. When the diagnosis came back and the prognosis was what it was, and Raymond had looked at his commanding officer with the full weight of everything he was walking away from behind his eyes, and he had said with the discipline, "I need to put in my papers." And he had. No hesitation, no deliberation. He had thought about it for exactly as long as it took to understand that there was nothing to think about. Dara had cried when he told her, not from gratitude, though there was that too, but because she knew what it meant. She knew what he was surrendering. And she had held him, and told him he was a fool, and he had held her back and agreed, and they had both known that neither of them meant it. She died 14 months later, and Raymond had become a mechanic because it was the closest he could get to the machines, without going back to a world he'd closed the door on, and he had raised his son, and he had lived on Caldwell Street, and he had worn the same boots, and he had carried what he carried in the particular way of a man who has learned that the weight doesn't get lighter, but you can, if you're disciplined enough, learn to walk without showing the effort. He looked at his sleeping son. Jalen's face in sleep was completely undefended, open and young and unmarked by the morning. The body having done what the mind couldn't quite manage and simply let go of it for a while. Raymond reached over and very carefully adjusted the toy plane so it wouldn't fall. Then he looked back at the clouds. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." A pause. "We're going to be making an unscheduled diversion." Jalen stirred. Raymond was already listening. "Due to a developing situation with our routing and some weather activity over Atlanta, we've been directed by air traffic control to divert to an alternate airfield. We expect to be on the ground within approximately 25 minutes. We apologize for the inconvenience and will provide further information as soon as it becomes available. The cabin filled with the particular sound of 40 people processing unwelcome news. Simultaneously, the murmuring, the rustling, the phones coming out the questions. Jalen was awake now, blinking disoriented. "Daddy, where are we going?" "Change of plans," Raymond said. His voice was steady. "We're landing somewhere else for a bit." "Why?" "Pilot's decision." He squeezed his son's shoulder. "It's fine." The woman in the cream blazer was on her phone speaking in a clipped, irritated voice about rescheduling. Across the cabin, people were doing the math of delays and connections and inconveniences. Raymond looked out the window as the plane began to descend, and through a break in the cloud cover, he saw for just a moment, before it was obscured again, the unmistakable shape of runways below. Long runways, wider than commercial. He recognized the layout. Something shifted in his chest. Very small, very quiet. He looked at the runway geometry again, at the infrastructure around it, at the shape of the buildings visible at the edges. He knew where they were going. He said nothing. He put his arm back around his son. He looked forward. And he was still. The plane touched down with the smooth authority of a pilot who knew exactly what they were doing. And as they taxied and the windows filled with views of hangars and military aircraft and the specific organized geometry of a U.S. Air Force installation, the cabin went very quiet. A different kind of quiet than before. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said, "we've landed at Dobbins Air Reserve Base outside of Atlanta. You'll be met by base personnel who will assist you during our brief ground stop. Please remain in your seats until we come to a complete stop and you've been cleared to deplane." Military base. The woman in the cream blazer had lowered her phone. Jalen was pressed against the window with his face as close to the glass as he could get, looking at the aircraft on the tarmac, the fighter jets parked in precise rows, the maintenance crews, the organized power of a military installation. "Daddy," he breathed. "Are those F-16 SE?" Raymond said. "And those on the end, those are F-22s. Jalen turned and looked at his father. "How do you know?" he asked. Raymond looked at his son's face, the open, wondering, entirely trusting face of a 7-year-old who has his toy fighter jet in his hands on a plane that has just landed on a military base, and he said quietly, "I used to know things like that." Then the aircraft stopped, and the door opened, and whatever was about to happen began. This story is just beginning. If you felt something in this first part, if you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or had to hold your dignity together when someone tried to strip it from you, you know why this one matters. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this travels. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Stay with us for what comes next. The door of the aircraft opened, and the air that came in was different. It wasn't the recycled, pressurized cabin air they'd been breathing for the last hour and 40 minutes. It was real air. Georgia summer air, thick and warm and carrying underneath it the unmistakable industrial undertone of jet fuel and hot tarmac and machine oil. The smell of a working base. Raymond breathed it in once. He didn't react. He didn't close his eyes or tilt his head or do any of the things a man does when something hits him in the chest. He simply breathed it in, processed it the way the body processes something deeply familiar that it wasn't expecting, and then he looked down at his son. Jalen was still pressed against the window, his nose almost touching the glass, watching the ground crews move between aircraft with the concentrated focus of a child who has just discovered that the world is larger and more extraordinary than he was previously aware. "Daddy," Jalen said without turning from the window. "How many people work on a base like this?" "Depends on the base," Raymond said. "A reserve base like this one, maybe 4,000 or 5,000. Active duty installation, you're talking 10,000, 15,000 easy." Jalen turned. "How do you know it's a reserve base?" Raymond glanced out the window. The layout, the specific configuration of the hangars, the particular spacing between the flight line and the administrative buildings, the type of aircraft parked in the visible rows. He'd known it from the air, but he wasn't going to say that. "Just a guess," he said. Jalen gave him the look, The look that said, "You don't guess, Daddy, you never guess." But he let it go, because a flight attendant was coming down the aisle telling passengers they were cleared to deplane. The woman in the cream blazer was already on her feet. Her phone was at her ear, and her carry-on was in her hand, and she was speaking in the fast-clipped cadence of someone managing a crisis, which in her world, Raymond understood, meant a disrupted travel itinerary. He watched her for a moment as she moved toward the front of the cabin, her blazer perfectly unwrinkled, her manner restored to the kind of confident authority that required an audience to sustain itself. She didn't look back at Raymond or his son. He hadn't expected her to. "Come on, Jay." Raymond pulled their bag from the overhead, settled it in one hand. "Let's go see where we ended up." The terminal building they were directed to wasn't a terminal at all. It was a reception building, the kind military installations maintain for exactly this sort of situation. Civilian aircraft diverted for weather or emergency, needing somewhere to put 40 confused passengers who hadn't planned on spending their afternoon at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, Marietta, Georgia. It was a large room, institutional, clean. A row of chairs along one wall, a long table where base personnel were already setting up coffee and water. 2 large windows that looked out onto the tarmac, and a flat-screen television mounted in the corner, running a 24-hour news channel on mute. A young airman in uniform stood at the door as passengers filed in, directing them with the efficient courtesy of someone trained to manage people in situations that haven't gone according to plan. He was maybe 22, 23, with the particular straight-backed posture of someone who hadn't been in long enough for the military bearing to become second nature. He was still working at it, consciously, still maintaining it the way you maintain something you haven't yet internalized. Raymond noticed. He noticed because he remembered that stage, remembered the effort it took before it stopped being effort. Jalen walked in beside him, his head turning in every direction at once, the toy F-22 in a death grip against his chest. He was trying to see everything simultaneously. The uniformed personnel, the equipment visible through the windows, the aircraft on the tarmac, the general organized power of the environment. He'd suddenly found himself inside. "This is a real Air Force base," Jalen said. Not a question, a statement, a declaration of the reality he was absorbing. "Yes, it is." "Do they have F-22s here?" "Saw some on the flight line coming in." Jalen's grip on the toy tightened. His jaw had lost its tightness from the plane. The emotion from the confrontation had been replaced by something else entirely, something that looked a lot like awe, and Raymond was profoundly grateful for the replacement. They found 2 chairs near the window and sat. Raymond set the bag at his feet. He watched the room fill. The 40 passengers from the flight distributed themselves around the space with the social geometry of strangers forced together, some clustering in small groups they'd formed on the plane, some isolating with their phones, some gravitating toward the coffee table with the focused purpose of people who require caffeine to process disruption. The woman in the cream blazer had positioned herself at the far end of the room, still on her phone, still managing her situation. She'd found a base liaison, a young female officer who was speaking to her with practiced patience and was explaining in considerable detail the professional consequences of this delay. Raymond looked away. Teresa, the flight attendant, came in behind the last of the passengers, and after speaking briefly with the young airman at the door, made her way across the room to where Raymond and Jalen were sitting. She crouched to Jalen's eye level first. "You okay, buddy?" Jalen nodded seriously. "This is a real Air Force base." "It is," Teresa said. "Pretty cool, right?" She looked up at Raymond. "Sir, I want to apologize for what happened on the aircraft. What she did with your sons—" "Don't," Raymond said. His voice was quiet, and he meant it without harshness. "You handled it right. That's what matters." Teresa held his gaze for a moment. "You have a remarkable kid." "I know it." She stood, gave Jalen a small smile, and moved off to where the base personnel were briefing the flight crew about estimated ground time and the weather situation over Atlanta. Jalen watched her go, then looked at his father. "She was nice." "She was." "Not like that other lady." Raymond looked at his son. "People are complicated, Jay. Most of them, when something hard happens, they freeze. They don't know what to do. That doesn't make them bad people. It makes them people who weren't ready. Jalen thought about this with the serious consideration he brought to everything his father told him. Were you ever not ready? Raymond almost smiled. Every day of my life. But you never froze. You freeze on the inside, Raymond said. The discipline is about what you do on the outside while the inside is figuring itself out. Jalen looked at him with the expression that Raymond had come to think of as the processing face. The look that appeared when something had been said that was going to take a while to become fully understood, that would sit in the back of the boy's mind and work on itself until it was ready to come back out as a different kind of knowing. The boy nodded once, as if filing it. Then he looked back out the window at the F-22s on the flight line. It was approximately 15 minutes after they'd settled into the reception building that the first person noticed. He was a pilot. Raymond made him immediately the same way. Raymond always made pilots. The specific way they stood the economy of movement, the tendency to assess spaces from the entrance before choosing where to position themselves. He was young, maybe 30 in his flight suit, which meant he'd either just come in from something or was about to go out, and he'd been directed to the reception building for some administrative reason that had nothing to do with the diverted flight. He came in, spoke briefly with the young airman at the door, then looked around the room with the assessing glance of someone who has just registered 40 civilians in a space that doesn't normally contain them. His eyes moved across the room. They landed on Raymond. Not on Raymond's face at first, on Raymond's posture. The specific way Raymond was sitting in the institutional chair, which was in fact the way you sit when you have spent years in cockpits and then years afterward, where you never quite forgot what it meant to be ready upright, without tension, alert, without visible effort, the particular quality of stillness that isn't passivity, but readiness. The pilot's eyes moved to Raymond's face. He looked for 2 seconds longer than a stranger normally looks. Then he moved to the coffee table, and Raymond looked back out the window. But the pilot didn't stay at the coffee table. He got his coffee. He took 3 sips. And then he walked across the room and stopped in front of Raymond and Jalen. "Sir," he said. "Excuse me." Raymond looked up. The pilot had the look of someone who is about to say something that he's aware might be wrong, might be an embarrassing miscalculation, but who has enough confidence in his own assessment to risk the embarrassment. "I'm Captain Derek Wynn, 33rd Fighter Wing Eglin. I'm up here for a training rotation." "Raymond Cole," Raymond said. He didn't elaborate. Wynn nodded. He was looking at Raymond with an expression that Raymond recognized. It was the expression of a person doing math. Rapid internal calculation. Something didn't add up, and the mind was working to figure out what was wrong with the equation. "You were on the diverted flight." "Yes." "Memphis." "Yes." Wynn looked at Jalen, who was looking back at him with bright interest, the toy F-22 evident in his hands. Wynn glanced at the toy, then back at Raymond. "Is that a Raptor?" "It is," Jalen said, immediately sitting up straighter. "My dad gave it to me. It's got a crack on the left wing, but I didn't want him to fix it because it looks like it's been through something." Wynn looked at the toy, then at Raymond again, and he said carefully, as if testing the words, "Have you ever been on an installation like this before, Mr. Cole?" There it was. Raymond held the pilot's gaze. He recognized the question for what it was: not small talk, not civilian curiosity. It was the specific question you ask when your pattern recognition is telling you something that your rational mind is still trying to verify. Wynn had seen something in the way Raymond held himself, and the question was the instrument he was using to check it. Raymond could have deflected. He'd deflected for 4 years. It had become its own kind of discipline, the deliberate maintenance of a life that didn't require the past to explain itself. But something about this room, this base, the smell of fuel that had hit him when the plane door opened, the sound of aircraft engines running on the tarmac beyond the windows, something about all of it had eroded a layer of the deflection. Not all of it, just a layer. "Once or twice," Raymond said. Wynn nodded slowly. He was still doing math. "What did you do before?" He said it the way someone says something they're not entirely sure they have the standing to ask. Raymond looked at his son. Jalen was watching his father now with full attention. The tarmac forgotten something in the quality of the conversation having registered to him as significant in a way he couldn't yet name. "Different kind of work," Raymond said. "What kind of work?" A pause. Raymond looked at Captain Derek Wynn, 30-something, 33rd Fighter Wing, a man who flew F-22s for a living and who was standing in front of him with coffee in one hand and the particular alert expression of a pilot whose instincts were telling him something his data hadn't yet confirmed. "I flew," Raymond said. Wynn went still. "What did you fly?" And Raymond, for the first time in 4 years, said it out loud in the presence of someone for whom the answer would mean something specific and irreversible. "Raptors." The word landed. Wynn's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "F-22s," Raymond said, in case there was any ambiguity. 9 years. Last duty station was Langley. Before that, Tyndall. Wynn put the coffee cup down, carefully, on the edge of the table beside him, as if he needed his hands free for something but wasn't sure yet what that something was. "What was your call sign?" His voice had changed, dropped half a register. Raymond looked at him. "Shadowhawk." The sound that came out of Captain Derek Wynn was not quite a word. It was the involuntary vocalization of a man whose entire understanding of the situation he's standing in has just been restructured. His eyes went wide, then went somewhere inward very quickly, and Raymond could see him pulling up data, could see him almost literally running through what he knew about the name, about the record attached to it, about the assessments and the sorties, and the reputation that lived in the institutional memory of the F-22 community, like a piece of mythology that had somehow never attached itself to a present-tense human being. "Shadowhawk," Wynn said. Not a question. Confirmation. "Yes." "The Shadowhawk." Wynn said it again with the definite article this time, and it was a completely different sentence. "From the Langley assessment, the 17 red flag." "Yes." "You scored a 97 on the Nellis evaluation." 98, Raymond said quietly. Wynn stared at him. Jalen looked between the two men with the focused attention of a child who knows that something important is happening, who can feel the gravity of it without yet having the context to understand its shape. "Dad," Jalen said, "what's a red flag?" Raymond looked at his son. Something was moving through him, not pride exactly, or not only pride. It was something older and more complicated. It was the feeling of a door that had been closed for 4 years, not locked, but simply shut, and someone had just put their hand on the knob from the other side. "It's a training exercise," Raymond said. "The Air Force runs it at a base in Nevada. They bring in all the best pilots and they run combat simulations. Best of the best, basically. And you went 3 times. Jalen stared at his father. "And you scored a 98. That was the highest recorded score in the evaluation's 12-year history," Wynn said. He was still staring at Raymond. He said it the way you state a documented fact, because it was. It's still the record. The room had not gone silent. There were still 40 passengers and base personnel, and the muted television, and the ambient sound of a functioning building around them. But in the small radius around Raymond, Jalen, and Captain Wynn, something had changed. 2 other passengers nearby had stopped their conversations. Not intrusively, not with staring, but they had stopped the way people stop when the frequency of a nearby conversation shifts into a register that the human ear involuntarily attends to. Jalen looked at his father with an expression that Raymond had never seen on his son's face before. It wasn't surprise exactly, or not only surprise. It was the expression of a child who is in the process of rebuilding his understanding of someone he thought he already knew completely. The foundation was the same. The love was the same. But the structure on top of it was suddenly larger and different, and the boy needed a moment to stand inside it and feel the new dimensions. "You never told me," Jalen said. "You never asked," Raymond said, which wasn't quite honest, and they both knew it. "And it was before your time." "Dad," Jalen's voice had gone very quiet. "That's not you were famous." "Not famous." "Among the right people," Wynne said with the careful definitiveness of someone contributing a correction. He was about as close to legendary as you get without a movie being made about you. Jalen stared at his father. Raymond looked at his son and said, "I left. It was the right thing to do. I'd do it again." He held the boy's eyes. "Some things matter more than the sky, Jay. You're one of them." The boy's chin moved. The jaw was doing the thing again, but this time it was different. Not the controlled anger of the plane. Not the suppressed hurt of watching his father be humiliated in public. This was something that didn't have a clean name. Something that sat in between pride and grief and love, and the specific disorientation of discovering that the person you love most has depths you hadn't known to look for. Jalen did not cry. He put his hand on his father's arm. Just placed it there, small and warm and deliberate. And Raymond put his hand over his son's and said nothing. Wynne excused himself. He said he'd be right back, which in Raymond's experience of people who said they'd be right back was sometimes true, and sometimes the prelude to a much longer absence. He watched the pilot cross the room, pull out his phone, and step into the corridor outside the reception area. Raymond watched him go. He had a reasonable idea of what was about to happen. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. 4 years of deliberate invisibility. 4 years of being the mechanic on Caldwell Street, of being the quiet father at Jalen's school, pickup of being the man at the hardware store and the grocery store and the church on Sundays who didn't require anything from anyone and didn't offer information about himself that wasn't specifically requested. 4 years of that had become a kind of identity. Not who he was, but who he'd chosen to be. And he had chosen it freely, consciously, the same way he'd chosen to leave the Air Force, not because he had to, but because the math was clear. But the math was shifting. He could feel it shifting the way you feel a change in air pressure before the weather turns. Across the room, the woman in the cream blazer had finished her phone call. She was sitting now, finally, in one of the institutional chairs near the door, her carry-on at her feet, her posture communicating dissatisfaction with the situation, in the way that expensive posture always communicates dissatisfaction with perfect stillness that implies the world owes it motion. She hadn't looked at Raymond since they'd come into the building. He wasn't thinking about her. He was thinking about Wynne in the corridor, and about what came next, and about whether the door that had just been opened was something he was going to walk through or close again. "Daddy." He looked at Jalen. "When you flew," Jalen said carefully. "What did it feel like?" Raymond thought about the question. He gave it the respect it deserved, which meant he didn't answer immediately, didn't reach for the first available words, but actually considered what was true. "You know what it feels like when you're falling asleep," Raymond said, "and right before you go all the way under, there's a moment when it feels like you're falling, and for just a second, your whole body just lets go of everything." Jalen nodded. "Like that?" Raymond said. "Except you're doing 40,000 feet and Mach 1.8 and everything is precise and everything matters and one wrong input and the consequences are not theoretical. So it's like that falling feeling, but you're completely awake. Every cell of you is completely awake." Jalen was looking at him with total absorption. "That sounds incredible," the boy said. It was. "Do you miss it?" Raymond looked at his son. "Every day." "Then why?" "Because," Raymond said quietly, and without any of the weight that the answer actually carried, "you needed a father more than the Air Force needed a pilot." Jalen was quiet for a moment. "Was I worth it?" he asked. The question came from somewhere very young and very honest, from the part of a child that hasn't yet learned to dress its fears in more acceptable clothing. Raymond turned fully to his son, looked at him straight. "Jalen Marcus Cole," he said, "you are the single best thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life, including all 9 years of flying the most sophisticated aircraft ever built by human hands. And that is not a close contest. Do you understand me?" Jalen held his father's gaze for a long moment. "Yes, sir," he said. "Good." The boy leaned into his father's side. Raymond let him. Wynne came back in 12 minutes. He came back with two other people. The first was a woman in her late 40s, also in flight suit, with the kind of rank insignia that didn't require Raymond to be active duty to read lieutenant colonel. The second was a man in dress blues older, who moved through the room with the particular unhurried authority of someone who has occupied senior positions long enough that authority has become ambient rather than demonstrated. Raymond saw them come in. He read the room immediately, instinctively, the same way he'd always read an airspace threat assessment: positional awareness, likely intentions. He knew why they were here. He knew who had made the call. Wynne walked directly to Raymond. The lieutenant colonel and the man in dress blues followed. Wynne stopped. He looked like someone who has just confirmed something he wasn't entirely sure he believed and is still absorbing the confirmation. "Mr. Cole," he said. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Haas, Operations Group Commander here at Dobbins, and this is Brigadier General Thomas Wick, who happens to be here for an inspection visit." Raymond stood. It was automatic. Something in the presence of that rank simply activated it. The same way standing up in certain spaces is automatic when you've spent enough years being conditioned to it. He stood, and he faced them, and his posture, the posture that had been civilian for 4 years, that had belonged to the mechanic on Caldwell Street, shifted. Not entirely, not back to what it had been, but enough that the shape of what it had once been was briefly unmistakably visible. General Wick looked at him. He was in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the face of a man who has seen a great many things and does not startle easily. He looked at Raymond the way a man of his experience looks at someone he's trying to place, not the way a civilian looks at a stranger, but the way a professional assesses someone in a discipline they both understand. "Raymond Cole," Wick said. His voice was the measured baritone of a man who had given orders in high-pressure environments for decades. "Langley 09 through 18. "Yes, sir." "Shadowhawk." "Yes, sir." Something moved across the general's face. Not sentimentality. Something more precise than that. Recognition. The specific quality of recognition that occurs when an abstract reputation becomes a concrete person. "I read your evaluations," Wick said. "The Nellis report, the red flag assessments. I was at the Joint Command briefing in 2016 when your Tyndall instructors gave the presentation on your low observable intercept sequences." He paused. "They used the word unprecedented." "They were generous," Raymond said. "They were accurate," Wick said. Then simply, "Why did you leave?" Raymond glanced down at Jalen, who was standing beside his father, one hand holding the toy F-22, the other now finding his father's hand and holding it. The boy was looking at the general with wide, quiet eyes. "Family," Raymond said. Wick's gaze moved to Jalen, then back to Raymond. He nodded one precise, understanding nod, the kind that doesn't require further elaboration. "What do you do now?" Haas asked. She was looking at Raymond with an expression he couldn't quite classify. It wasn't pity, it wasn't condescension, it was something more complex, something that had weight to it. "Aviation mechanic," Raymond said. "Memphis." "You're working on engines?" "Yes, ma'am." "F-22 engines. Commercial, mostly 737 power plants and regional turboprops." He paused. "Though I know my way around a Pratt & Whitney F-119. Haas looked at him steadily. "I don't doubt it." Behind them, Raymond was aware that the room had shifted. Not dramatically, people weren't standing up. Nobody was making a scene. But the social geometry of the space had reorganized itself. Conversations had quieted. The passengers from the flight who had been managing their disrupted afternoon with varying degrees of patience had become peripherally aware that something was happening in the corner of the room that was different in kind from a delayed departure. The woman in the cream blazer had turned her chair almost imperceptibly. She could see them now without obviously watching. Raymond could see her from the corner of his eye. He wasn't thinking about her. He was thinking about General Wick's question, "Why did you leave?" and the way the answer had felt in his mouth. Family. One word. The entire weight of his adult life in one word, and the extraordinary inadequacy of it as a summary. He thought about Dara in the hospital in the 3rd month when it had become clear that the prognosis wasn't going to change. He thought about the look on her face when he'd told her he was putting in his papers. He thought about the way she'd said, "Raymond, you don't have to," and the way he'd stopped her mid-sentence, not harshly, but with the absolute certainty of someone who has already done the math and doesn't need to run it again. "I know I don't have to," he'd said. That's not the same thing as the right thing to do. He thought about Jalen at 3 years old, then 4, then 5, learning to make breakfast, learning to be quiet in the mornings, learning the particular combination of courage and tenderness that a child learns when they grow up in the close orbit of a parent who has chosen them completely and consistently every day without complaint. He thought about all of it in the 3 seconds between Haas's question and his answer, and what came out was simply, it was the right call. Wick looked at him for a long moment. Then the general did something that Raymond hadn't been expecting. He put out his hand, not to shake, not in the casual way of a social introduction. He extended his hand with the deliberate weighted quality of someone offering something that is more than a physical gesture, an acknowledgement, a recognition. Something that required the other person to accept it, knowing what it meant. Raymond looked at the hand. He took it. Wick's grip was firm and held 1 count longer than a standard handshake. "It's good to know where you are," the general said. "It's good to know you're still standing." Raymond held his grip. "Always, sir." Wynne was watching this exchange with the expression of a young pilot who is filing everything away, the kind of experience that shapes understanding in ways that won't become fully visible until years later. Jalen was watching too. His small hand was still in his father's left hand, and he was looking up at the brigadier general and the lieutenant colonel and the captain, who all seemed to know his father in some way, that Jalen was only now beginning to understand. The shape of, and the boy's expression, was very still and very serious in the way that children are still and serious when they are in the presence of something they understand, matters profoundly, even if they can't yet say exactly why. Wick looked down at Jalen. "Is that your boy?" he said to Raymond. "Yes, sir, Jalen. He's 7. Wick crouched. He was a brigadier general in his early 60s, and he crouched to the eye level of a 7-year-old the way a person does when they take children seriously. "Jalen," he said. "That's a good name." "Thank you, sir," Jalen said with the gravity of a child who has been raised to address adults correctly. Wick's eyes went to the toy F-22. "That your aircraft?" "Yes, sir. My dad gave it to me." Jalen paused, and then added with the particular purposeful certainty that Raymond recognized as inherited. His call sign was Shadowhawk. Wick held the boy's gaze. "I know it was," he said. Then he smiled, a real one, not the managed kind. "Take good care of him, son." Jalen looked at the general, then at his father, then back at the general. "I will," Jalen said. "He takes good care of me." The general stood. He looked at Raymond one more time, with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he'd suspected, and nodded. Then he turned and walked toward the door, and Haas followed, and Wynne lingered for just a moment to look at Raymond with an expression that didn't resolve into any single readable thing. Awe maybe, or the specific emotion that occurs when something has moved from the category of legend into the category of reality. And the distance between those two categories turns out to be smaller and more human and more affecting than expected. "I'll check on the weather situation," Wynne said. "See what the ETA is looking like for the Atlanta routing." "Appreciate it." Wynne nodded, started to walk, stopped. He turned back. "Mr. Cole," he said. "For what it's worth." He stopped, started again. "I've been flying Raptors for 6 years. I've met maybe 3 people in my career who I thought truly understood the aircraft, not just flew it, understood it." He held Raymond's gaze. "Your name is in the evaluations I studied when I was training, like the way Lombardi's name is in coaching textbooks, like a benchmark." He shook his head. "I'm sorry we're meeting like this." "Don't be," Raymond said. "This is exactly the right way to meet." Wynne looked at him for another moment, then looked at Jalen, then walked out. Jalen watched him go. Then he looked up at his father. His face was doing something Raymond had never seen it do before. something that hadn't had occasion to appear on a 7-year-old's face in the house on Caldwell Street, in the mornings that were quiet in the school pickups, and the dinners, and the Saturday mornings at the garage, and the Sundays at church. Something that required exactly this room, this base, this afternoon, this sequence of events to have the conditions to exist. It was pride, not the simple pride of a child who has done something well. The more complex, more aching, more overwhelming pride of a child who has looked at his father, the whole of his father, the past and the present together at once, and understood for the first time in a way that goes past the mind and into something deeper exactly who he is. Raymond Cole looked at his father, and his eyes were full and his chin was steady, and he held the toy F-22 Raptor against his chest like a promise. And Raymond Cole looked back at his son and felt for the first time in 4 years something that was very close to whole. The room had changed. Not physically, the chairs were in the same positions. The coffee table still stood against the far wall. The television still ran its muted headlines in the corner. But the atmosphere had shifted in the way atmospheres shift when information moves through a space and reorganizes the understanding of everyone inside it. It was subtle. It was real. Raymond felt it the way a pilot feels a change in air pressure, not through any single identifiable instrument, but through the accumulated data of everything at once. People were looking at him differently, not all of them. Most of the 40 passengers from the flight were still managing their afternoon the way disrupted travelers manage disrupted afternoons with phones and coffee and the resigned patience of people who have decided that the situation is outside their control, and the only available response is to wait. But a handful of them, the man in the suit 3 rows back, who had said, "You're making a scene on the plane," a couple in their 60s near the window, the younger woman who'd been sitting across the aisle from Raymond for the whole flight. A handful of them were looking at the corner of the room where Raymond and Jalen sat with an expression that was working through something. Recalculating. Running the new data against the existing conclusion and finding that the conclusion required revision. Raymond didn't seek out any of these looks. He didn't avoid them either. He simply sat with his son beside him and let the room be what it was. Jalen had not moved from his father's side since Wynn and Haas and General Wick had walked back out. He was pressed close, the toy F-22 still against his chest, and he was doing the processing face thing. The internal recalibration that Raymond had watched happen 100 times over 7 years, the specific expression his son wore when the world had just revealed itself to be larger than previously understood. "Dad," Jalen said after a long silence that had been full of its own content. "Yeah. How come you never told me any of that stuff?" Raymond thought about the honest answer. He turned it over, found its edges, checked its weight. "When your mom got sick," he said, "I left that world. And when you leave something that was that big a part of who you were, you don't always know how to carry it into the new life. Sometimes it feels like those two things belong to different people. Like the man who flew those planes and the man who makes your breakfast every morning can't both fit in the same story." Jalen considered this. "But they do fit," he said. "They're both you." Raymond looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "They are." "Then they fit." 7 years old. The clarity of 7 years old was Raymond had always thought one of the most underrated phenomena in human experience. Children cut to the truth of things. Not because they're wise, they're not in the way that comes from time, but because they haven't yet learned all the reasons the truth is complicated. They haven't yet accumulated the scar tissue that makes directness hurt. They just say the thing. They fit. He reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. The boy leaned into it. The door to the corridor opened again, and this time it wasn't Wynn or Haas or anyone Raymond had already spoken to. It was a staff sergeant, late 20s, compact and efficient, with the ground crew energy of someone who spent their professional life on the flight line rather than behind a desk. He came in moving with purpose, scanned the room, found Raymond, and walked directly to him. "Mr. Cole." "Yes. Staff Sergeant Anthony Briggs, sir. General Wick asked me to come find you." He stopped, and then in the slightly self-conscious way of someone who has a message to deliver and isn't entirely sure of the protocol for delivering it. "He'd like to know if you and your son would like to see the flight line." while you're grounded, if you're interested." Jalen's head came up so fast he nearly hit his father's chin. Raymond looked at Briggs. "He offered that—" "Yes, sir." Briggs paused. "I think if I'm being straight with you, the general would like to show you something. He was pretty specific about it. Said to make sure you came if you were willing." Raymond held for a moment. He looked at Jalen, who was vibrating with the contained energy of a child who is trying very hard not to express his desire for something, in case the expression of it somehow causes it not to happen. "Yeah," Raymond said. "We'd like that." Jalen exhaled. "Yes," the boy said in a voice that communicated approximately 9,000 words. Briggs almost smiled. He looked at Jalen's toy. "Good-looking raptor you've got there." "It has a crack on the left wing," Jalen said, "because it's been through something." Briggs looked at the toy, then at Raymond, then back at the toy. "That's about the most Air Force thing I've ever heard from a 7-year-old, he said. He led them out. Yahalbam. The flight line was exactly what the smell through the plane door had promised: fuel and heat, and the organized mechanical power of a working installation, all of it operating on the scale that only military infrastructure achieves, a scale that puts the individual in correct proportion to the machinery and the mission. Raymond walked out onto it and breathed. He didn't stop walking. He didn't make any visible gesture of recognition or response. But he breathed, and somewhere in the center of him something expanded, the way a cramped muscle expands when pressure is removed from it, the way a held breath becomes an exhale relief that isn't dramatic because it's too deep for drama. Jalen walked beside him with his face turned upward, taking in the aircraft on the flight line with an expression of absolute and total absorption. He was holding his toy F-22 in his right hand and his father's hand in his left, and he wasn't speaking, which was itself an indication of the magnitude of his response. Raymond Cole was a child who narrated his world constantly, who filled silence with questions and observations, the way a musician fills silence with notes. When he went quiet, the thing in front of him had achieved something his language couldn't keep up with. The F-22s were parked in a row at the near end of the flight line. 6 of them, matte gray against the bright Georgia afternoon. Enormous in the way that aircraft are always larger on the ground than any photograph prepares you for their geometry, distinctly aggressive, even at rest, the angular sweep of the wings, the twin vertical tails, the overall impression of something designed by people who understood that stealth and lethality are not separate considerations, but the same one. Raymond looked at them. He hadn't stood this close to an F-22 in 4 years. He stood there for a count of 3, just 3 seconds, which was long enough, and then he looked away because looking longer would cost him something, and this wasn't the moment for that expenditure. General Wick was standing near the closest aircraft, talking to 2 officers. He saw them come out and walk toward them with the unhurried authority of a man who has nowhere to be except where he decides to be. "Mr. Cole." He looked at Jalen. "And this must be the crew chief." Jalen looked up. "I'm his son," he said. "Jalen." "A crew chief is the person responsible for an aircraft," Wick said. "They make sure it's ready to fly. They know that plane better than anyone, that a job that matters to you." Jalen thought about this with complete seriousness. "Yes, sir. Then you're the crew chief." Wick put out his hand, and Jalen shook it, which he did with the same 2-handed grip Raymond had taught him and which caused something in the general's expression to warm significantly. He looked at Raymond. "Walk with me." They walked along the flight line, the 3 of them, Raymond and Wick and Jalen, with Briggs trailing at a respectful distance, and Wick spoke the way men who have spent careers in command speak, directly without preamble, with the assumption that the person beside him was capable of receiving what was being said. "I've been in this uniform 41 years, Wick said. "In that time I've worked with somewhere in the neighborhood of a lot of pilots, a number I stopped counting because the number stopped meaning anything useful." He looked at a passing maintenance crew. "I want you to know that I say what I'm about to say, as someone for whom the word exceptional has been diluted by overuse. I try not to say it anymore." Raymond waited. "Your record," Wick said, "is exceptional." Raymond said nothing. "Not your scores alone, Not the Nelly's number, not the red flag assessments, the whole record. The decision-making documentation, the post-sortie analysis reports the evaluations from your commanding officers at Tyndall and Langley both. The way you managed flight leadership. The incident reports you never had. He paused. You know what the most telling thing in your service record is? No, sir. 9 years. Not a single avoidable incident. Not one. Wick let that sit. You know what the accident rate looks like for high-performance tactical aviation across 9 years. You know what the statistical baseline for close calls and procedural deviations looks like in that time window. I have a sense of it. Your record is clean in a way that isn't luck. Luck doesn't stay consistent for 9 years. That's discipline. That's situational awareness at a level most pilots never reach. Wick looked at him. You know all this already. I know what I did, Raymond said. I don't spend a lot of time with what other people made of it. No, Wick said. I don't suppose you do. He was quiet for a moment. They walked. How's the mechanic work? Good work, Raymond said. I like it. You like working on engines. I like understanding machines from the inside, what they need, why they do what they do. He glanced at a parked F-22. Commercial stuff is slower, less extreme, but the principle is the same. You listen to the machine, you find what's off, you fix it, you send it back into the air. That part doesn't change. Wick nodded. You ever think about coming back? The question arrived without warning, which Raymond suspected was intentional. Wick was the kind of man who understood the strategic value of a question delivered without the runway of context. Raymond looked at Jalen, who had moved slightly ahead of them, and was standing as close as Briggs would allow to the nearest F-22, staring up at the aircraft, with the toy version in his hand, holding the two versions of the same machine up together, as if comparing them, as if checking the real one against the model for fidelity. No, Raymond said. Your boy's older now. He's 7. Some men find a way to do both. Some men do, Raymond agreed. That's not the life I chose. Wick looked at him. What did you choose? Raymond watched his son hold up the toy F-22 against the silhouette of the real one. I chose to be there, he said. Every day, completely. I chose for him to know what it feels like to have a father who showed up. Every single day. He paused. His mother didn't get the time she deserved. I can't fix that. But I can make sure what time he has with me counts for something real. The general was quiet. She was sick for a long time, he said after a moment. 14 months from diagnosis. That's a hard road. Yes, sir? For both of you. For all 3 of us. Raymond said it simply. Without performance. She was extraordinary. She would have wanted him to know that. I try to make sure he does. Wick stopped walking. Raymond stopped beside him. The general looked out at the flight line, at the aircraft, at the personnel moving between them, at the organized, purposeful machinery of an installation that existed to project power and protect people, and he was quiet for long enough that Raymond understood the silence was intentional. Was in some way the point. Then Wick said, I'm going to tell you something. It's not official. It's not a conversation that's in any record anywhere. It's just one man telling another man something that's true, and you can do whatever you want with it. Raymond waited. The community. The F-22 community. There are people in it who still talk about Shadowhawk, who still use your records as benchmarks, who still pull your post-sortie reports when they're training new pilots in low observable intercept doctrine. He looked at Raymond. You left a mark, not the kind that fades, the kind that gets built into the foundation of what comes after. Raymond held the general's gaze. He didn't have a response for that. Not a verbal one. Some things land in a place that's deeper than where language begins. I thought you should know it, Wick said. Given, he stopped. Looked across the tarmac to where through the reception building windows, the shapes of 40 passengers were dimly visible, going about their disrupted afternoon. Given the morning you've had. Raymond understood. Wynne had told him, or Haas had. Someone had briefed the general on what had happened on the plane, and Wick had absorbed it and processed it through his own understanding of people and service and what it meant to watch a man who had given what Raymond had given be treated the way Raymond had been treated in that cabin. The general hadn't said anything about it directly. He hadn't needed to. He'd done something better. He'd come out here to the flight line with the specific intention of standing next to Raymond Cole on the tarmac of a military installation and saying, "I see what you did. I know what it cost, and I know what you're worth." Raymond said, "Thank you, sir." Simple. Complete. Wick nodded once and looked out at the aircraft. Jalen had gotten close enough to the F-22 that he was almost under the wing with Briggs beside him answering questions in the patient-specific way of someone who both knows the answers and recognizes that the child asking them is not asking casually. "How fast does it go?" Jalen was asking. "Classified," Briggs said. "But faster than you're thinking. Faster than 1,000 miles an hour. Significantly." Jalen processed this. "How high?" "Also classified." "Is everything classified?" "A lot of it." Jalen looked at the aircraft. "My dad knows all of it, though." Briggs looked at Raymond approaching. "Yeah," he said. "Your dad knows all of it." Jalen turned and looked at Raymond and then back at the aircraft, and then his face did something that Raymond almost missed because it happened quickly. A brief, private smile that wasn't performing for anyone, that was just the natural expression of a child who has just assembled a piece of his world into a shape that satisfies him deeply. "Dad," Jalen said, "can I sit in it?" "The cockpit." Raymond looked at Briggs. Briggs looked across the tarmac at Wick, who had followed at a distance. A look was exchanged. Wick made a small gesture with his head. Briggs looked back at Jalen. "You want to go up?" Jalen's entire face became something that didn't have a name. "Yes, sir," he said in a voice that was trying very hard to remain composed and not entirely succeeding. Briggs called over one of the maintenance crew. Two of them positioned the access steps beside the aircraft. Raymond watched as Briggs lifted Jalen up, the boy holding his toy F-22 tightly against his chest the whole way, and helped him ease into the cockpit, the actual cockpit of an actual F-22 Raptor, and lower into the seat. The seat dwarfed him. He was 7 years old, and the aircraft was built for a man in a flight suit and helmet and full tactical gear, and Jalen sat inside it like a seed inside a machine, small and bright-eyed and completely, absolutely in his element. He looked down at his father. Raymond was looking up at him. "Dad," Jalen said. His voice came out slightly different, slightly rearranged, as if the altitude of the cockpit, the few feet of elevation above the tarmac, had changed the acoustics of it. "Dad, is this what it was like?" Raymond looked at his son in the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor. "Similar," he said. "Except when the engines are on, the whole thing is alive. It's different when it's alive." "What does that feel like?" Raymond put his hand on the side of the aircraft. The metal was warm from the Georgia sun. He felt the surface of it under his palm, the particular material, the specific texture, and said, "Like everything you didn't know you needed." Jalen looked at the instrument panel in front of him. He touched nothing. He was extremely careful not to touch anything, with the instinctive respect of a child who understands that some things are to be treated with reverence. He looked at the controls and the displays and the geometry of the space, and he said very quietly, so that only Raymond could hear, "I want to do this, Dad." Raymond held. "When I grow up," Jalen said, "I want to fly one of these." Raymond looked at his son's face, open and absolutely certain, the way children are certain about the things that have just claimed them completely. "Then you will," Raymond said. "You think so?" "I think," Raymond said, "that you have stubbornness from your mother, attention to detail from me, and more courage than either of us, and if you decide to do something, the main thing standing between you and doing it is time." Jalen looked at him for a long moment. "You'll help me, every single day." The boy looked back at the instrument panel. He sat in the seat with the toy F-22 in his lap, and the real one around him, and his father's hand on the side of the aircraft below him. And he was. Raymond could see taking a photograph with the part of the mind that doesn't use a camera, storing the image of this moment, the feeling of this moment in the specific deep storage facility of memory that retrieves things not on demand, but at the moments when they're most needed. Raymond understood the instinct. He was doing the same thing. They were back inside the reception building within 20 minutes. The weather update had come through. Atlanta's routing was clearing, and the airline was estimating departure within the hour. Passengers were beginning to settle into the second phase of waiting, the more optimistic phase, the one where the end was visible. Raymond and Jalen came back in through the corridor door. Jalen was talking. The silence of the flight line had broken, and the words were coming back rapid and layered, and full of the specific energy of a child who has experienced something they need to process through language. He was describing the cockpit. He was describing the instrument panel. He was asking his father what each control he remembered seeing was for, and Raymond was answering each question in sequence patiently and accurately. They came through the door, and the room did something. It wasn't orchestrated. There was no signal, no cue, no coordination. But several things happened in a compressed space of time that, taken together, constituted something that Raymond would not be able to explain fully afterward, even to himself. Wynne was standing near the door, and when Raymond came in, he straightened. Not to attention. It wasn't formal, wasn't military, wasn't anything with a name or a protocol. He just straightened the way a person straightens when the presence of someone they deeply respect enters a room, and he nodded. The man in the suit from 3 rows back, the one who had said "You're making a scene on the plane," had been sitting with his coffee near the window. When Raymond came in, he stood up. He looked directly at Raymond, and he said in a voice that was quiet, but carrying, "Sir, I owe you an apology. I should have said more on that plane. I'm sorry I didn't." Raymond looked at him. "You said enough," Raymond said. "You said it when it counted." The man held his gaze for a moment, then nodded and sat back down. But he was different for the exchange. His posture was different. His expression was different. The internal reckoning that had clearly been running in him since the general and the lieutenant colonel and the captain had walked across the room was slightly more resolved. The couple in their 60s by the window, the woman made eye contact with Raymond and smiled. Not the smile of someone who needs acknowledgement returned. The smile of someone who wants to offer something small and sincere and has chosen the simplest available instrument for it. Raymond nodded to her. She looked at Jalen and said, "Handsome boy." "Thank you," Jalen said, because he had been raised to respond when addressed, and then looked up at his father with an expression that communicated mild personal embarrassment at the compliment, which Raymond noted was entirely age-appropriate, and therefore quietly satisfying. Teresa, the flight attendant, was at the far end of the room, talking with the captain and first officer. She looked up when Raymond came in. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked at Jalen and smiled the specific smile of someone who has watched a hard morning find its way to something better. The room was different. The information had moved through it the way information moves through any closed space containing human beings, through overheard conversation, through the visible interactions, through the particular social osmosis by which people in proximity to significant events absorb them, even when they're not directly participating. 40 passengers who had boarded a Memphis to Atlanta commercial flight that morning had found themselves at a United States Air Force Reserve base, and in that strange, compressed afternoon, had watched a man who had been publicly humiliated in their presence turn out to be someone whose name made generals stop walking. Raymond was aware of all of it. He processed it the way he processed everything fully efficiently, without letting it show on his face. But he did not look for the woman in the cream blazer. He didn't need to find her. He knew she was there. He'd clocked her position when they came back in the same peripheral awareness that made him note everything in a space. She was where she'd been before, near the door, though she'd shifted the angle of her chair in the way people shift when they don't want to be observed doing something. She was watching him. He felt it. He didn't look. He guided Jalen to their chairs by the window, sat down and picked up the conversation about the cockpit controls exactly where they'd left off at the door. He answered Jalen's questions about the heads-up display and the thrust vector controls, and the way the sensors created a real-time picture of the airspace around the aircraft. He answered all of them in order precisely the way he'd always done. Because his son was asking. And that was what mattered. Briggs came back in about 10 minutes after them. He was carrying something. He crossed the room and stopped in front of Raymond and held out what he was carrying, which was a folded piece of fabric. Dark blue. Raymond could see the edge of a patch on it. "This is from the General," Briggs said. He said, and I'm quoting directly because I want to make sure I get this right, he said, "Tell him it belongs to him more than it belongs in any display case." Raymond took it. He unfolded it slowly. It was a flight suit patch, the kind worn on the shoulder, the kind that designates squadron and assignment. But beneath it, folded inside it, was something else. A photograph printed on standard paper, clearly taken from a digital file. Black and white. A man in a flight suit and helmet, standing next to an F-22 on a tarmac. The man's helmet visor was up. Raymond looked at the photograph. He looked at it for a long time. It was him. Younger, late 20s, early 30s, somewhere in the Tyndall years. The flight suit was his. The helmet was his. The aircraft behind him was his. The man in the photograph was standing with the easy, grounded authority of someone in complete possession of his purpose, who exists in full alignment between what he is and what he does. Raymond didn't remember the photograph being taken. He couldn't place the day. But he recognized the man in it. Jalen had been watching. He looked at the photograph from beside his father. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up at his father's face, at the present-day face, the 43-year-old face, the face with the lines around the eyes, and the permanent work marks on the hands, and the particular quality of a man who has carried serious weight for a long time, and he looked back at the photograph. "That's you," Jalen said. "Yes, you look..." He stopped, searched, found, "You look like someone who knows everything about what he's doing." "I did," Raymond said. "Back then?" "You still do," Jalen said. "You just do different things now." Raymond looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "I do." He folded the photograph carefully, folded the patch around it, held both. From across the room a voice, not loud, not dramatic, not performing for anyone. A woman's voice. Precise. Controlled. And underneath the precision and the control, something that required visible effort to keep contained. "Mr. Cole?" Raymond turned. The woman in the cream blazer was standing up. She was looking at him directly with the expression of someone who has been in a private reckoning for the past hour and has come out of it changed in a way that does not show as triumph, but as something much less comfortable. Her posture was still excellent. She was still, in every external way, the woman in the expensive blazer who flew this route twice a month. But something had gone out of her. The particular quality of absolute certainty, the settled, unquestioned conviction that her read of things was correct and that the world arranged itself accordingly, that was gone. She had his attention. The room had his attention, though Raymond kept his eyes on her. She said, "I owe you an apology." He said nothing. "I owe your son an apology," she said. "What I said on that plane..." She stopped, pressed. "What I did with his..." She stopped again. "There is no version of that I can explain or justify, and I'm not going to try." She held his gaze with the particular effort of someone who knows they could look away and are choosing not to. "I was wrong. About all of it. From the moment I looked at you." Her voice had gone down. "I made a judgment about who you were from things that had nothing to do with who you are. And I was wrong. I was..." She stopped. Her jaw moved. "I was cruel. To your son. And I'm sorry." The room was very quiet. Jalen was looking at the woman. Raymond let the silence stand for 3 full seconds. He held her gaze the way he'd held it on the plane, steadily, without heat, without the performance of either forgiveness or withholding. Then he looked at Jalen. "Jay," he said. Jalen looked at him. "What do you want to say?" The boy looked at his father, looked at the woman. He was 7 years old, and he had watched his father be humiliated, and he had felt the particular helpless fury of a child who cannot protect the person they love most. He had watched his father absorb it, and stay still, and pick up the toy, and hold everything together without raising his voice once. He looked at the woman for a long moment. "I forgive you," Jalen said. Simple, certain. The way a child says the thing his father has demonstrated is true before he could articulate it in words. Raymond looked at his son and felt something in the center of his chest that didn't have a clean name, but was warm and steady and enormous. Then he looked at the woman. "We're all right," he said. She nodded. Once, twice. She sat back down, and she turned toward the window, and the profile of her face was different from the one that had boarded the plane that morning. The architecture was the same, but something had been dismantled and not yet rebuilt, and in the space where it had been, she was simply a person in a room without the fortifications. Raymond turned back to his son. Jalen was looking at him. "Did I do it right?" the boy asked. "You did it perfect," Raymond said. Jalen looked satisfied. He looked down at the toy F-22, turned it over in his hands once, and looked back out the window at the flight line. "Dad," he said. "Yeah. I'm glad we came on this trip." Raymond looked at his son. The boy's face turned toward the window, toward the aircraft outside, toward the enormous and extraordinary world that had just revealed a little more of itself, and he put his arm around his son's shoulders and pulled him in. "Me too, Jay," he said. Outside the windows, the flight line hummed with the organized power of machines built for purposes that required the best that people could give. The Georgia afternoon was burning toward evening. Somewhere over Atlanta, the weather was clearing, and in a reception building at Dobbins Air Reserve Base, a 7-year-old boy leaned against his father's side with a toy F-22 in his hands, and a full heart, and his father held the folded photograph of the man he'd been, and both of them looked out at the sky. The boarding announcement came 47 minutes after they'd returned from the flight line. A calm professional voice over the building's intercom system, not the airline's standard recording, but a base communications officer, which gave it a different texture, a different authority, informed the passengers that their aircraft had been cleared for departure, that Atlanta's routing had reopened, and that they should begin gathering their belongings and proceed to the aircraft in an orderly fashion. The room responded the way rooms respond to good news, after a long wait with collective exhale, with the rustling of coats and bags and phones being pocketed with the particular energized movement of people who have been stationary too long and are glad for a reason to move. Raymond didn't move immediately. He sat for a moment with his arm still around Jalen's shoulders and watched the room reorganize itself into the geometry of departure. He watched faces. He watched the man in the suit fold his newspaper with the careful deliberateness of someone whose mind was somewhere other than what his hands were doing. He watched the couple by the window stand together, the woman touching the man's arm briefly, a small unconscious gesture of the kind couples make when they've been together long enough that contact has become a language. He watched Teresa coordinating with the captain near the corridor door. Her professional composure fully restored her face, showing none of the difficulty of the morning that had preceded the afternoon. He watched the woman in the cream blazer. She stood when the announcement came as everyone stood. She picked up her carry-on. She straightened the blazer with the automatic gesture of a woman who has straightened it 1,000 times. But she didn't move immediately toward the door. She stood for a moment with her hand on the handle of the bag, and she looked at nothing in particular at the middle distance at the floor, at some interior landscape that Raymond couldn't see and didn't try to. He looked away before she looked up. "Are we going?" Jalen asked. "Yeah." Raymond stood, pulled their bag from where it rested beside the chair, offered his hand to his son. "Let's go see your grandma." Jalen took the hand. "Do you think she'll like hearing about the F-22? "She'll like hearing about anything that comes out of your mouth," Raymond said. "That woman has never met a story from you she didn't want all the way to the end." Jalen smiled. It was a full smile, uncomplicated, the kind that had been in short supply during the morning portion of the day, and that Raymond now registered with the quiet internal accounting of a father who tracks his child's joy, the way some people track their savings, not obsessively, but attentively knowing the balance matters. They walked toward the door. Captain Derek Wynne was in the corridor. He was leaning against the wall outside the reception building door, arms crossed, clearly waiting. When Raymond came through, Wynne straightened and fell into step beside them, without invitation, which Raymond read correctly as an intention to walk them to the aircraft. They walked in silence for a moment. Jalen was between them, looking at the flight line through the corridor windows. "You heading to Eglin tonight?" Raymond asked. "Tomorrow morning," Wynne said. "I've got a debrief here in the morning, then I'm wheels up at 11. He paused. "You're going to Atlanta to see family." "My mother. She had surgery a couple months back. Hip. She's recovering well, but she wanted to see Jalen." Wynne looked at the boy. "Your grandma must be something." "She is," Jalen said without looking up from the window. "She makes the best sweet potato pie I've ever tasted, and she calls me her heart, which I think is a little much, but I don't tell her that." Wynne laughed. It was genuine, the kind of laugh that a person doesn't perform, but that simply happens to them. He looked at Raymond with an expression that communicated something along the lines of, "Your kid is extraordinary, and I think you probably know that, but I wanted to say it with my face." Raymond acknowledged it with the slight tilt of his head that served the same function. They came out onto the tarmac and the aircraft was visible 50 yards ahead, the same commercial jet that had brought them here, refueled, now its door open and the boarding steps positioned. Ground crew moved around it with the businesslike efficiency that Raymond always watched, with the particular attention of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and why it mattered. At the base of the boarding steps, two figures were waiting. Raymond saw them and slowed by half a step, just half the kind of adjustment that Jalen didn't register, but that Wynne, who was watching Raymond, caught. General Wick was there, and beside him, Lieutenant Colonel Haas. They were standing at the base of the boarding steps, with the still deliberate quality of people who have positioned themselves somewhere on purpose. Not casually, not incidentally. They were there because they had chosen to be there, and the choosing was itself the point. Behind them, slightly to one side, stood Briggs and 4 other base personnel. 2 in flight suits, 2 in BDUs, who were also standing with the particular quality of intentionality. Not at attention, not formally, but with the specific uprightness of people who are preparing to do something that matters to them. Raymond understood what was coming before it arrived. He understood it the way you understand weather, not from a single sign, but from the accumulation of several, from the changed pressure and the quality of the air, and the specific way the light is falling. He understood, and he walked forward anyway, because there was no other direction, and because whatever was coming was not something he would dishonor by stopping short of it. Jalen felt his father slow, and looked up. He saw the people at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at them, then at his father, then back at them, trying to read the situation. "Dad," he said quietly. "What's happening?" "Just walk," Raymond said. "Stay with me." "Okay." They walked. When they were 10 feet from the bottom of the boarding steps, General Wick stepped forward. He looked at Raymond with the direct, unperforming gaze of a senior officer who has decided to do something and is doing it without apology. "Mr. Cole," he said, "before you go." Raymond stopped. Wick looked at him steadily. "There are things this institution is good at and things it has failed at. Recognizing what it has in the people who serve it, who served it, recognizing that in the right way at the right time, that's something we don't always do well." He paused. "We don't always understand what a man has given until he's already stopped giving it, and by then, the moment for saying it has usually passed." The tarmac was quiet, except for the ambient sounds of a working base, distant engines, machinery, the organized human activity of an installation that doesn't stop. "Today is a small correction," Wick said. "It doesn't account for everything, but it's what we have available." He stepped back, and Staff Sergeant Briggs, standing to the left, came to attention. Then the 2 in flight suits came to attention. Then the 2 in BDUs. Then Lieutenant Colonel Haas. Then General Thomas Wick. Brigadier General, United States Air Force raised his right hand to his temple in a salute that was precise and unhurried and held. For Raymond Cole. Former Major. Call sign Shadowhawk. Record clean for 9 years. 98 on the Nellis evaluation. Tyndall and Langley. 3 red flags. The man who had walked away from the sky to be a father. Raymond stood at the base of the boarding steps, with his son's hand in his, and the photograph of himself folded in his pocket, and the smell of jet fuel in the air, and he received the salute. He held. Then slowly, with the full weight of someone for whom this gesture carried everything it was designed to carry, Raymond Cole brought his right hand up. He returned it. He held the salute for 3 full seconds, 3 deliberate, unhurried counts, the way you hold something that deserves to be held, and then he brought his hand down. Nobody moved for a moment. Jalen had watched the entire thing with total stillness. The boy was not crying. He was 7 years old, and he was standing at the base of an aircraft boarding staircase on a United States Air Force base, and 6 military personnel, including a brigadier general, had just saluted his father and Jalen Marcus. Cole was not crying because he was somewhere past the place where tears were adequate. He was in the place where the body simply holds what it has received and tries to find enough room for it. His hand tightened in his father's. Raymond felt it. He squeezed back. Wynne, who had stopped a few paces behind them, was looking at the flight line. His jaw was set. His eyes were doing the thing that men's eyes do when they are refusing to be publicly affected by something that is affecting them. Wick stepped forward one last time. He put his hand out again, not the formal offer of part 2 this time, but something more personal, more direct, the handshake of one man to another man. Raymond took it. "Take care of that boy," Wick said. "Every day," Raymond said. Wick looked down at Jalen. "You've got a great father-son." Jalen looked up at the general. His voice, when it came, was quiet and completely certain. "I know it," he said. The aircraft was quieter on the return leg, not because there were fewer people. It was the same 40 passengers plus crew, exactly as it had been on the outbound flight, but because the quality of their silence was different. On the morning boarding, the silence of the cabin had been the neutral private silence of strangers who have no particular relationship to one another. Now it was different. They had been through something together the way strangers become something other than strangers when they have shared an experience that carries weight. Raymond and Jalen were in the same seats, 2C and 2D. Raymond had the aisle. Jalen had pressed himself against the window before the seatbelt sign came on, watching the Dobbins flight line shrink away as they lifted his nose, almost touching the glass, again, his toy F-22 in both hands. "I can see the flight line," Jalen reported. "I can see the F-22s. They look small from up here." "Everything looks small from up here," Raymond said. "Even big things, especially big things." Jalen considered this, watching the base disappear into the Georgia landscape below. "Is that good or bad?" Raymond thought about it. "It's honest," he said. "From a certain altitude you see the real proportions of things. What's actually big and what just seemed big because you were close to it." The boy was quiet for a moment, watching the world recede. "The lady who said those things to you," he said, "on the way here." He kept his eyes on the window. "Was she scared of something?" The question surprised Raymond, not because it was wrong, but because it was arrived at by a 7-year-old through a route he hadn't mapped. He looked at his son's profile and thought about the answer honestly, the way he thought about any answer Jalen deserved a real one to. "Probably," he said. "People who work hard to feel above other people, usually there's something underneath that, something they're protecting." What was she protecting? "I don't know her well enough to say." Jalen turned from the window. "But you didn't hate her." "No. Even after what she did." "Hate is expensive, Jay, and it doesn't buy you anything worth having. It just takes up space that could have something better in it." Jalen looked at him. "Grandma says that. Grandma's a smart woman. She says you're the most stubborn person she ever met and also the best one." "That's accurate on both counts," Jalen smiled, the small private smile, the one that didn't perform. He looked back out the window. The seat across the aisle 2A was occupied now by an older man who'd moved from the back of the plane, the couple in their 60s, from by the window in the reception building. They were settled in together, the man at the window, the woman on the aisle, and as Raymond glanced across, the woman caught his eye. "I hope your mother's recovery goes well," she said, simply without preamble. "Thank you," Raymond said. "She's tough. She'll be fine." "You're from Memphis?" "Yes, ma'am. Born and raised." She nodded. Something in her expression was still working through the afternoon's recalibrations. "I've been flying for 40 years, she said. "Commercial private, I've been in the air a lot. I want you to know that what happened on this plane this morning—" She stopped. "I should have said something sooner. I want you to know, I know that." Raymond looked at her. She had kind eyes, the kind that had been kind for a long time, and showed the work of it. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "No," she said. "But I want you to know it anyway." He nodded. She looked at Jalen. "And your young man with the toy plane. He said something on that plane that I won't forget." Jalen, who had been listening with the ostensible nonchalance of a child who is absolutely paying full attention, looked over. "He said, 'My daddy worked really hard to buy these seats,'" the woman said, "and the way he said it." She shook her head slightly. "That's a child who knows his father." Jalen looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at his son. "He works hard at everything," Jalen said. "That's kind of his whole thing." Ben. Teresa came by with the drink service 30 minutes out from Atlanta. She stopped at Raymond's row with the specific intention of stopping, not just moving through, but pausing with the small deliberateness of someone who has something to say and has decided this is the moment for it. "Apple juice," she said to Jalen. "Yes, please." He accepted the cup with both hands and set it very carefully on the tray table, with the heightened caution of a child who has already been party to one apple juice incident and has no intention of being party to another. Teresa looked at Raymond. "And for you, sir." "Coffee, please. Black." She poured it, handed it over, and then instead of moving on, she said, "I've been doing this for 11 years, this route, this airline. I've seen a lot of mornings." Raymond waited. "I want you to know," she said, "that this morning the way you handled yourself, the way you handled it for your son." She stopped. "I've seen people handled a lot of different ways on a lot of different flights. I've seen people lose themselves. I've seen people make it worse. I've seen people—" She paused. "What you did. The way you stayed yourself. That's not a small thing. Most people can't do that." Raymond held her gaze. "I had a lot of practice," he said. "I know," Teresa said. "That doesn't make it easier." She moved on. Raymond held his coffee cup and looked at the back of the seat in front of him and thought about what she'd said. Staying yourself. He had a complicated relationship with that phrase because the self he had maintained through the morning in that cabin was a specific chosen self, not the whole of him, but the controlled, disciplined exterior of him, the self, that the years had taught him to project in situations where the full self was not safe to occupy. The question he hadn't let himself sit with until now, until this altitude, this distance from the events with his son alive and warm beside him in Atlanta 25 minutes ahead, was whether that kind of staying was the same as wholeness, or whether it was a different thing. Whether the discipline he'd exercised for so many years was a form of integrity, or whether it was in some sense that he couldn't quite see all the way around a form of hiding. He thought about Wick's salute. He thought about Wynn's face when Raymond had said the call sign. He thought about Briggs holding his son up into the cockpit of the F-22. He thought about Jalen's hand tightening in his at the bottom of the boarding stairs. He thought about the photograph folded in his pocket, the man in the flight suit who knew exactly what he was doing. He thought about Dara saying, "I see it, even when no one else does I see it," and about what it meant that she was gone and that the seeing had to come from somewhere else now. From the people on this tarmac who'd read his record and came out to the flight line. From his son, who said they fit, they're both you. From the stranger across the aisle, who said that's a child who knows his father. He thought about all the mornings on Caldwell Street, the quiet ones, the ones where the alarm wasn't needed, and the coffee ran, and the photograph on the windowsill was the first thing he saw, and the last thing he saw. And he understood sitting at altitude in a commercial aircraft 40 minutes from Atlanta, with apple juice carefully arranged on his son's tray table, and his son's warm weight gradually returning to his side, as the boy fell back into the comfortable half-sleep of the well-loved and the safe. He understood that the discipline hadn't been hiding. It had been carrying. There was a difference there. Hiding meant the thing was covered because you were ashamed of it or afraid of what it would do if it got out. Carrying meant you held it because it was yours and it was heavy, and you were the one responsible for it, and the holding was not a concealment, but a stewardship. He had carried the sky. He had carried the loss of Dara. He had carried the years since. He had carried the mornings and the school pickups and the dinners and the quiet and the judgment of strangers and the worn boots and the grease-marked hands and all of it. He had carried it the way he'd flown with discipline and attention and the knowledge that one wrong input, one uncontrolled moment had consequences that weren't theoretical. And it had not broken him. Not because he was invulnerable. He wasn't. He knew the exact shape and location of every crack in him, the way a good mechanic knows an engine. But because he had learned over years and at great cost that the carrying itself was a form of strength. That the man who holds everything together is not the man who has nothing inside him, but the man who has everything inside him and has made a choice about what to do with it. He had made that choice every morning since Dara died. He would make it every morning that came after this. The seat across the aisle shifted. Raymond looked over. The woman in the cream blazer had moved. She'd been at the back of the business class section for the whole flight, in a different seat from the morning foray against the window, as far from Raymond's row as the section allowed. Raymond had registered the distance without comment. She'd needed it. He understood needing distance when you were reckoning with something. But now she had moved. She was in 2A, the same seat she'd occupied that morning, but on the opposite side from Raymond now, since the older couple had taken 2A and moved her across. She sat down with her bag on her lap, which meant she was not planning to be there long, and she looked at her hands for a moment before looking up. At Raymond. He met her gaze. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to know that you don't have to answer it." "All right." She paused, organized herself. "Why didn't you say anything on the plane?" She held his gaze. "You knew who you were. You knew you had every right to be in that seat, and not just because of the ticket. You knew what you'd done. You knew your record." She stopped. "Why didn't you say anything?" Raymond looked at her for a moment. "Because it wasn't the point," he said. She waited. "Whether I flew F-22s, or whether I stocked shelves at a hardware store in Memphis, my right to be treated with basic human decency doesn't change. I shouldn't have to have a record to justify sitting in a seat I paid for." He held her gaze without heat, without performance. "If I'd told you my call sign on that plane, you'd have stopped. But nothing I said would have changed what you initially decided when you looked at me. That's the part that matters. That's the part I can't fix by telling you my evaluations." The woman held his gaze. She was working through what he'd said with the concentrated attention of someone receiving something difficult and choosing not to deflect it. "You're right," she said, quietly. Not the managed, prepared apology from the reception building. This was something that arrived more slowly, that had been arriving since then, and was only now reaching the surface. "You're completely right. And I knew it before I knew anything before any of this afternoon happened. I knew it when I saw your son's face, when he stood up for you." She looked at Jalen, who was asleep against his father's arm. 7 years old. "He's been knowing things young," Raymond said. "It's what happens when a kid has to grow up alongside hard things. You get smart early." "Is that?" She stopped, tried again. "Is that a good thing?" Raymond looked at his son's face in sleep. Open, unguarded. The processing face relaxed into simple rest, The worry and the wonder and the intense 7-year-old engagement with the world all quieted for a while. "It depends," he said. "It means he has less childhood than some kids. That costs something. But it also means he has more." He searched for the word. "He has more depth than he would have otherwise. He came by it honestly, and he's going to need it." The woman nodded. She was still looking at Jalen. "What was his mother like?" she said. It was a personal question, the most personal she'd asked. Raymond considered whether it was the right question to receive from this person in this moment, and decided it was. Not because she'd earned it through any particular process, but because it was an honest question, and Dara deserved honest answers from anyone who asked. "Extraordinary," he said. "She was the kind of person who made you feel when she was looking at you like you were the most important thing in the room. Not because she was performing attention, she wasn't. Because she genuinely, completely, fully invested herself in whoever was in front of her." He paused. "She was also the most stubborn person I've ever known, and she was frequently right about things before the evidence was in, which made her both infuriating and essential." He looked at his son. "Jay has her stubbornness and her instincts. He gets the important stuff from her." "And the flying," the woman said. Raymond almost smiled. "Maybe that's mine." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry for your loss. Not just today. For all of it." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She stood, went back to her seat. Raymond looked at the back of the seat in front of him again. The city was probably visible by now if he looked out his son's window, but Jalen was occupying the window and Raymond didn't want to disturb him. He thought about Atlanta below his mother's house, the hospital visits that had stretched through the spring. Cecile Cole at 72, still running her household with the iron gentle authority she'd always had, still calling Raymond every Sunday at 7 p.m., without fail, still referring to Jalen as my heart, without any apparent concern that this might be a lot. He thought about what she would say when he told her about the day. She would say, first, "Are you all right?" He would say, "Yes, Mama." She would say, "And Jalen?" He would say, "He was incredible." She would say, "Of course he was." And then a silence while she took it all in. And then, Raymond. "Yes, Mama. You know your daddy would be proud of you." And he would hold the phone and not say anything for a moment, because that sentence always required a moment. And then he would say, "I know, Mama." And she would say, "Good. Now what time are you getting in? I have the guest room ready and there's food, and I don't want Jalen eating airport food, so you tell me the time." He smiled at the back of the seat. Jalen shifted against him, mumbled something in the language of partial sleep, settled back. Raymond put his arm around his son. The captain came on the intercom with 20 minutes to landing, the professional cadence of someone bringing passengers home. Altitude weather in Atlanta, temperature on the ground. Local time, the standard formulations of commercial flight that Raymond had always found oddly comforting in their consistency. He heard the landing gear come down. Felt the aircraft configure for approach. Felt the controlled descent begin, the particular sensation of altitude, surrendering to the earth, the way the world below grows slowly larger and more detailed and more specific, until the abstraction of altitude resolves into the recognizable particular of a city, a runway, a place that exists on maps and in lives. He heard the wheels make contact with Atlanta concrete. He felt the deceleration. He heard Jalen wake, a small intake of breath, a blink, the rapid reorientation of a child returning from sleep to reality. "We here," Jalen said. "We're here." Jalen looked out the window. Atlanta moved past outside in the particular way of airports at ground-level service vehicles, other aircraft, the infrastructure of arrivals and departures. "Grandma's here," Jalen said. "She's at the house. Briggs is picking us up." He caught himself. "A car service. We'll be there in 40 minutes. Jalen nodded. Then he looked at his father. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Today was a lot." Raymond laughed. It came out genuine, the kind that arrived on its own, that didn't ask permission. Yes, it was. It was the best day I've ever had, Jalen said. Is that weird? Because some of it was really bad. But I think it's still the best. Raymond looked at his son. No, he said. That's not weird. The best days usually have some heart in them. It's how you know they were real. Jalen considered this. He looked at his toy F-22. He looked at the window. He looked at his father. I love you, Dad, he said. The way a child says it when they mean it specifically, not as a reflex, not as a closing to a sentence, but as a statement that stands on its own and requires nothing in return. Raymond held his son's gaze. I love you, Jay, he said. More than the sky. Jalen smiled. The aircraft came to its gate. The door opened. And Raymond Cole, 43 years old, mechanic, single father, former major, call sign Shadowhawk, gathered his bag and his son and walked off the plane into the Atlanta afternoon, carrying everything he was and everything he'd been and everything he was still becoming, all of it together at once. He walked without hesitation. He walked like a man who knows the weight, and has chosen to carry it anyway. The car service driver was a quiet man named Gerald, who had one of those faces that had seen enough of life to stop being surprised by it, and who asked no questions beyond confirming the address and whether the temperature in the car was comfortable. Raymond appreciated this. He sat in the back seat with Jalen pressed against his side, the city moving past the windows in the particular way of late afternoon Atlanta, golden and thick and unhurried in the way of southern cities in summer, where the heat itself seems to slow everything to a pace that has more room in it than the rest of the country allows. Jalen was awake but quiet. He had his toy F-22 in both hands, and he was turning it slowly, examining it the way he sometimes examined things after a significant experience, as if the object itself had changed, as if what he'd been through had altered the thing he was holding in some way that only he could see. Raymond watched this without comment. He understood it. He'd done the same thing at various points in his life, held familiar objects after significant experiences, and turned them over, looking for what had changed, only to find eventually that the object was the same and the change was entirely internal, and the object was simply the instrument through which the internal change made itself visible. "Daddy," Jalen said. He hadn't looked up from the toy. "Yeah. When we get to Grandma's, are you going to tell her everything?" "I'll tell her what matters." "What matters?" Raymond looked out the window. A long boulevard, old trees, the kind of neighborhood that Atlanta has in abundance, residential and green, and possessed of the specific dignity of places that have been lived in long enough to accumulate character. "That we're safe," he said. "That the trip was good, that you sat in an F-22 cockpit." He paused. "That her grandson stood up for his father on an airplane in front of 40 people and didn't back down." Jalen was quiet for a moment. "She's going to cry," he said. "Yes, she is. She cries pretty easy." "She's earned it," Raymond said. "A woman who's been through what she's been through gets to cry whenever she wants." Jalen considered this with the philosophical seriousness he brought to things his father said that didn't have obvious immediate answers. He turned the F-22 over one more time, then held it up against the window, silhouetting it against the passing city. "Do you think she ever worried about you?" Jalen asked. "When you were flying?" "Every single day," Raymond said. "She told me so. She said she kept a candle lit in the kitchen from the day I went to Tyndall until the day I put in my papers." Jalen lowered the toy. "That's a long time to worry." "That's what it costs to love someone who does dangerous things," Raymond said. "You don't get to turn the love off while they're in the air, so you carry it. You just carry it." Gerald made the turn onto Cecile Cole's street, and Raymond immediately recognized the specific configuration of the houses, the particular tree at the corner that had grown substantially since the last time he'd been here, the general quality of a street that had aged gently and well. His mother's house was the third from the corner on the right. Small, well-maintained, with the kind of front porch that was clearly used, and not merely decorative, 2 chairs, a small table, a hanging plant that had been tended with serious intention. The porch light was on even though it was still afternoon. She'd turned it on for them. Raymond saw it, and something in him came loose in a small private way. Not publicly, not in any way that showed. But something released the particular tension of a man who has been on guard for a long time, arriving somewhere where the guard is not required. Gerald pulled up to the curb. Raymond paid and thanked him, and he and Jalen were on the sidewalk with their bag before the front door opened. Cecile Cole was 72 years old and had recently had hip surgery and walked with the particular careful purpose of someone navigating a recovery they are determined to win, and she came through that front door and across the porch and down the 3 steps to the front walk faster than any of this would suggest was possible. "There he is," she said, not to Raymond, to Jalen. Jalen went to her the way he always went to her, completely without reservation, crossing the distance between them at a run, and coming into her arms with the full-body trust of a child who knows completely where he is welcome. Cecile held him. Both arms, her face pressed into the top of his head, and she made the sound that grandmothers make when they are holding the person they love most in the world, after an absence low and grateful, and not quite words. Then she looked up at Raymond. She looked at him the way mothers look at their grown sons, with the particular, comprehensive assessment of someone who has known this person from before they could speak, who has seen every version of them, who is capable of reading in a 3-second look what most people couldn't identify in a 3-hour conversation. She looked at him, and she saw the day in his face. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you. I've got food on the stove, and you can tell me everything while I finish it." Job. Cecile Cole's kitchen was the kitchen of a woman who took nourishment seriously, not in the performative way of someone who wants credit for cooking, but in the deep, practical, love-made physical way of someone who has fed people through hard times and knows that a good meal is one of the most honest forms of care available to a human being. She had collard greens on one burner, rice on another, a roasted chicken that had been done for an hour and was resting under foil, and something in the oven that smelled like cornbread and made Jalen's face perform an involuntary expression of pure happiness the moment they came through the kitchen door. "Sit," Cecile said with the authority of a woman in her own kitchen. They sat. Jalen at the kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea that appeared in front of him without him asking for it. Raymond in the chair nearest the window, the same chair he'd sat in for most of his childhood, which had a specific creak in it that hadn't changed in 40 years, and which he recognized the way you recognize an old friend's voice before you've fully registered the face. Cecile moved around her kitchen with the careful efficiency of a woman managing a hip recovery without letting it manage her. She was small and straight-backed, and had the kind of face that had been beautiful young and had become something richer and more specific with age. The face of a woman whose every experience had been absorbed rather than deflected, whose life showed in her features not as damage, but as depth. "All right," she said, not looking at them, her attention on the collard greens she was adjusting. "Tell me about the trip." Jalen looked at his father. Raymond looked at his son. And they told her. They told it the way a father and son tell a story together, picking up the thread from each other, filling in what the other left out, occasionally disagreeing gently about a detail, and resolving it without either one surrendering entirely. Jalen told about the airport, about his first time going through security, about how the plane was bigger inside than he'd expected, and how the seats in business class reclined in a way that felt genuinely luxurious. He told it with the narrator's instinct he'd always had, building toward things, leaving spaces understanding without being taught that a story has a shape and the shape matters. Raymond watched his mother's face while Jalen described the woman in the cream blazer. Cecile's hand stilled on the stove. Just for a moment. Just long enough. Then they resumed their work, and she said nothing, and Raymond knew she was doing what she had always done when she was receiving difficult information, storing it carefully, letting it settle, refusing to react before she understood the full picture. Jalen described the apple juice, the toy being picked up and dropped. His own voice what he'd said to the woman, which he reported with the slight self-consciousness of a child who has done something brave and isn't sure yet what to do with the fact of having done it. Cecile turned from the stove. She looked at her grandson. "You stood up," she said. Jalen nodded. "For your father." "Yes, ma'am," Cecile Cole looked at Jalen for a long moment with an expression that Raymond had seen on her face only a handful of times in his life. A look that was too full for a single name, that was love and grief and pride, and the specific complex emotion of a woman who has raised a son through hardship and is now watching that hardship reproduced in his son's life, and watching also simultaneously the inheritance of the strength she'd put into that raising. She crossed the kitchen and put her hands on Jalen's face. Both hands cupping the boy's jaw the way she had cupped Raymond's jaw when he was exactly Jalen's age. She looked at him directly. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said. "And I am so proud of you. And you are the bravest 7-year-old I have ever known in my 72 years of knowing people." Jalen's chin went. He held it, just barely. "Thank you, Grandma," he said. She kissed his forehead, went back to the stove, and Raymond, watching this, pressed his back teeth together and looked at the window and breathed through the full weight of the moment, the way he breathed through everything completely evenly, giving it the full respect of his attention without letting it take him under. "And then," Cecile said to the stove, because she knew there was more. Then Raymond took over. He told her about the diversion, about Dobbins, about the smell of the air through the plane door. He told it carefully and without embellishment, with the precise narrative economy of a man who respects language enough not to waste it. He told her about Wynne, about the question, "Have you ever flown before?" and about his own answer, the call sign, the 2 words that had changed the frequency of the room. Cecile's back was to him. He watched her shoulders. He told her about Haas, about Wick, about walking onto the flight line and the 6 F-22s in their row, and what the smell of jet fuel on an active base did to a man who had once lived inside that smell for 9 years. He told her about Jalen in the cockpit. And here Cecile turned around. She turned and she looked at Jalen, who was nodding with the bright-eyed confirmation of someone whose testimony has been accurately presented, and she said, "You sat in it." "All the way inside," Jalen said. "In the seat. Briggs lifted me in, and Dad stood at the side, and I could see him through the glass. And I held my toy one up next to the real one. He held up the F-22. And they looked the same, except the real one was bigger." Cecile put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Then she put it down and said, "Lord," quietly and privately, as if the word was for someone other than the people in the room. Raymond told her about the salute. He told it simply. He didn't dramatize it. He laid it out as a sequence of events, Wick and Haas and Briggs and the 4 others at the base of the boarding stairs, the formation, the hands rising, what he had done in response. He reported it the way a man reports something that happened to him and that he is still internally in the process of receiving as fact, because the emotional content was still being processed in the place where processing happens slowly and privately and without audience. Cecile heard every word. When he was finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the simmer of the greens and the small sounds of the oven. Then Cecile said, "Your father would have saluted back." Raymond looked at his mother. "He would have stood there with his chin up and saluted back," she said, "just like you did." She looked at her son with the total knowing of 43 years. He would have been there. He would have seen it. And he would have said exactly what I'm saying right now, which is that you are the best man I know. And I am not saying that because you're my son. I'm saying it because it is accurate. Raymond held his mother's gaze. The kitchen held the silence. Then Jalen said, "Grandma, is the cornbread ready?" And the kitchen laughed, all 3 of them, the kind of laughter that has grief and gratitude and love, all mixed together into a single, unclassifiable sound. The specific laugh of a family that has been through things and is still here and knows it. After dinner, after the collard greens and the chicken and the cornbread and the sweet potato pie that Jalen ate 2 pieces of and pronounced with the solemnity of a food critic, rendering a verdict the best thing he had ever tasted in his life, which Cecile received without false modesty, because she knew it was true. After all of that, Raymond and Jalen sat on the front porch in the 2 chairs while Cecile rested inside. The evening was doing what Georgia evenings do in summer, Cooling slowly, the heat of the day releasing in layers, the trees beginning to show their colors in the long sideways light. The street quieting from its afternoon pace to the more settled rhythm of evening neighborhoods. Jalen had the toy F-22 in his lap. He was looking at the sky. It had been clear over Atlanta for hours. The weather that had diverted them to Dobbins, long resolved, and the early stars were appearing in the east. The first ones always do, the ones bright enough to show through the residual light of a summer evening. "Dad," Jalen said. "Yeah." "What's the highest you ever flew?" Raymond thought. 60,000 feet, once in a test profile. Normally operational ceiling is lower, but that was a special evaluation. Jalen looked at the sky. 60,000 feet. He was calculating. That's more than 11 miles up. About that. "Could you see stars during the day?" Raymond looked at him. "Yeah. From that altitude in the right conditions, you can see stars during the day. The sky gets darker. You're above most of the atmosphere." Jalen was quiet. "That must have felt like being between two worlds," he said. Raymond looked at his son. He had not, in 9 years of flying, and 4 years of not flying, and all the thousands of hours he had spent thinking about what it had meant to be in that aircraft, ever heard it described that way. Between two worlds. He turned the phrase over, found its edges, checked its weight. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what it felt like." Jalen looked down at the toy in his lap, up at the sky, down at the toy. "I'm going to do it," he said. "I decided." Raymond looked at his son's profile, the set jaw, the forward angle of the chin that came directly from Dara, the particular quality of certainty that didn't bluster or perform, but simply existed fully formed and unhurried. "Fly," Raymond said. "Be a pilot, Air Force." Jalen looked at him. "Like you." Raymond held the boy's gaze. "Better than me," Raymond said. Jalen shook his head. "I want to be as good as you." "Aim higher," Raymond said. "Always aim higher than the person you're using as a reference point. That's how the thing gets better over time. Each generation pushes the ceiling up a little. That's how it's supposed to work." Jalen thought about this. "Okay," he said. "Better than you. That's the right answer. But I still want to learn from you." "Every day I've got left," Raymond said. "Everything I know." They sat with that for a while, the specific, comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill the space between them because the space between them is already full of something that doesn't require words to exist. The first firefly appeared in the yard. Then another. Jalen watched them with the focused delight of a child who has seen fireflies before, but for whom they have not yet become ordinary, which Raymond hoped would last. Hoped his son would be the kind of person for whom fireflies never became ordinary, for whom the world retained the capacity to produce small, exact wonders and have them received as such. "Dad," Jalen said. "Yeah." "That lady on the plane." Raymond waited. "Do you think she's a bad person?" Raymond looked at the yard at the fireflies in the growing dark. "I think she's a person who did a bad thing," he said. "I think she made choices today that came from fear and habit, and things that probably got put in her a long time ago by people and experiences I don't know anything about. And I think those choices were wrong, and they hurt you, and they were the kind of thing that should never happen." He paused. "And I think people who do bad things aren't always entirely bad people. I think the two things can be true at the same time." Jalen considered this. "Is that fair to her?" "I'm not interested in fair to her," Raymond said. "I'm interested in true. Fair is a calculation. True is just what is." Jalen nodded slowly. "She apologized." "She did. And I forgave her." "You did." Jalen looked at the toy in his lap. "Did that feel right to you?" "It felt like you," Raymond said. "Which means yes." The boy sat back in his chair. He looked at the sky, which was darkening now in earnest, the blue deepening toward the navy that precedes full dark, more stars appearing, the moon showing its edge above the tree line. "Mom would have forgiven her too," Jalen said. Raymond looked at the moon. "First," he said. Your mother would have forgiven her first, and then she would have found a way to make the woman understand exactly why what she did was wrong, in a way that the woman would carry for the rest of her life. Not harshly, but completely. He paused. Dara had a gift for that. Telling people the truth in a way they couldn't deflect. Jalen smiled, the private one, the real one. I want to be like that. You're already like that, Raymond said. You told her on that plane. You said your father worked hard for those seats. You told her the truth when you were 7 years old and scared, and she was an adult with a plane full of people behind her, and you didn't flinch. Jalen was quiet for a moment. I was scared, he said. I know. You could tell. I know your face, Jay. I know every frequency of it. The boy looked at him. Were you scared? Raymond held his son's gaze. Yes, he said. Not of her, but scared for you. Scared that you were taking something in that would stay in you wrong. That it would plant something in you that I wouldn't be able to get back out. He paused. That's the fear. When you're a parent, it's not usually the big physical dangers. It's the invisible ones. The things that get inside and change the way a person sees themselves. Did it, Jalen said. Plant something wrong. Raymond looked at his son, at the boy who had stood up on that plane, who had held the toy F-22 like a promise, who had sat in a general's salute and said simply, he takes good care of me, who had forgiven a woman who hurt him, who was now sitting in his grandmother's porch chair at 7 years old, asking his father with complete honesty whether he had been damaged by the day. No, Raymond said. I don't think it did. I think it planted something right. Jalen looked at the sky for a long moment. Good, he said. The porch light came on, not because it was needed yet, but because Cecile inside had decided it was time, which was its own form of communication. Raymond recognized it. She was saying, you are here. This is your home. The light is on. Jalen yawned. A full, unguarded yawn that he made no effort to conceal, followed by the slightly embarrassed expression of a child who has yawned in front of someone and considers this a minor social vulnerability. You're done, Raymond said. I'm not tired, Jalen said, which was transparently false. You sat in an F-22 cockpit, watched a general salute your father, had a full dinner, and processed more in one day than most adults manage in a month, Raymond said. You're tired. Jalen did not argue this because it was accurate. Come on, Raymond said. He stood, picked up the bag, held the door. Jalen stood, toy F-22 in hand, and walked to the door. He stopped just before going inside and looked back at the sky. One more look, a deliberate one, the kind that says, I'm not done with you. I'll be back, and then he went in. Raymond stood for a moment on the porch alone. He looked at the sky. The stars were fully out now, the moon clear of the tree line, the kind of night that opens upward in a way that daylight conceals. He stood and looked at it, and let himself feel what he hadn't fully let himself feel all day, the accumulated weight of it, the morning's insult, and the afternoon's recognition, and the salute, and his son's face in the cockpit, and the photograph in his pocket, and Dara's absence running through all of it, like a thread that changed the color of everything it passed through. He felt it, all of it. He stood on his mother's porch and let the full weight of the day land on him. Let it be as heavy as it actually was, without the discipline, without the management, without the careful, controlled exterior that the day had required. He let the morning's humiliation be as ugly as it had been. He let Wick's salute be as large as it had been. He let his son's hand tightening in his be as important as it had been. He let Dara's absence be as present as it always was, the specific way she was most present in the moments that should have included her, and didn't. He stood with all of it, and then he breathed. One long, full, complete breath in and out the way you breathe after you've been holding something, and he reached into his pocket and took out the folded photograph. He unfolded it in the porch light. The man in the flight suit. Younger. Standing beside the F-22. Visor up. The ground crew visible behind him, the sky behind that. He looked at the man in the photograph. He thought about what Jalen had said. They fit. They're both you. He thought about what Cecile had said. "You are the best man I know." He thought about what Dara had said in the kitchen years ago, the sentence that had become a kind of internal compass. "I see it. Even when no one else does. I see it." He folded the photograph. He put it back in his pocket, and he understood, standing on his mother's porch in Atlanta, Georgia, at the end of a day that had required more of him than most, he understood that a man's life is not a single story. It is many stories running simultaneously, layered on top of each other, each one true and each one incomplete on its own. The pilot's story was true. The father's story was true. The husband's story was true. The son's story was true. The man in worn boots who boarded a commercial flight that morning was true. The man whose call sign had made a brigadier general stop walking was true. All of it true. All of it simultaneously. All of it him. And the woman in the cream blazer had looked at one layer, the most visible, the most surface, and had decided she had seen the whole. Had decided that what she could read from a man's boots and his hands and his clothes was sufficient to locate him in the world, to determine his worth, to pronounce on whether his presence in a particular seat was appropriate. She had been wrong. Not because he was a legendary pilot, not because General Wick knew his name, not because his evaluations set records that still stood. She had been wrong because the premise was wrong, because no reading of a man's surface, however confident, however supported by the unexamined biases of a lifetime's accumulated assumptions, is sufficient to determine his worth. Because worth is not located in surfaces. Because the places where worth actually lives in the choices made under pressure, in the love sustained through loss, in the dignity maintained. When dignity is expensive, in the child raised. Right in a hard world, these places are not visible from the aisle of a commercial aircraft. You have to be willing to look. You have to be willing to see. The door behind him opened. Cecile. "Come inside, Raymond," she said. "It's getting cool." He turned. His mother stood in the doorway in the porch light, 72 years old, recovered and upright, and possessed of the specific, unassailable quality of a woman who has outlasted hard things and intends to outlast more. She looked at her son the way she had always looked at him, with the complete, unconditional, unsentimental love of a woman who had decided from his first breath that he was worth everything and had never once revised that conclusion. "How's Jay?" he said. "Asleep before his head hit the pillow," she said. "He's got your toy plane on the nightstand." Raymond looked at his mother. "Thank you for turning the porch light on," he said. Cecile looked at him for a moment. "I've been turning that light on for you since you were 6 years old," she said. "I don't intend to stop." Raymond walked to the door. He stopped beside his mother and put his arm around her shoulders carefully, because of the hip, but completely because she was his mother, and this was her porch, and they were both still here and still standing, and that was not a small thing. She put her hand over his. They stood like that for a moment, not speaking, not needing to, and looked out at the Atlanta night, at the stars and the fireflies and the quiet street with its old trees. Then they went inside. The door closed. The porch light stayed on. Because some lights you leave burning, not because the person is still out there, but because they made it home, and the light is how you say. So, and the saying matters, and the mattering is everything. And a man who knows he is seen and loved, and waited for, and received, that man can face whatever morning brings, and the morning after that, and every morning that follows, for as long as he is willing to rise and carry what is his, and love what he has been given. Raymond Cole was willing. He always had been. That was the whole of it. That was enough.